Welcome back, sweet dreamer. Tonight on Sleepy Crown, we continue our tranquil journey through the age of medieval kings in part 2, beginning with the fascinating reign of Edward the Confessor, the last great Anglo-Saxon monarch, and gently arriving at the remarkable stories of Athelstan, the first true king of England, and Edward the Elder, the forgotten architect of English unity. Before you let sleep take you away, please like this peaceful tale. Share a comment about which of these 3 rulers you found most fascinating, and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. Get comfy under your blanket, let your thoughts slow, and allow the soft echo of medieval England to carry you gently towards sleep. If you enjoy these calming tales, we're always happy to have you here in our cozy circle of history lovers. Edward, later known as Edward the Confessor, was born between 1003 and 1005 at a town near Oxford called Islip. His father was King Ethelred II, also known as Ethelred the Unready, who had ascended to the throne at just 12 years old in 978 after the murder of his half-brother King Edward. His mother was Emma, a Norman princess of Danish origin born sometime in the 980s, whose father was Richard I, Count of Rouen. The reign of Ethelred the Unready, although initially peaceful, witnessed an increase in Viking raids that started from 991, when the Norwegian marauder Olaf Tryggvason invaded England with an armada of 93 ships and killed many of Ethelred's noblemen at the Battle of Brunanburh. Following this disaster, and in the wake of the deaths of many of his most trusted advisors in battle or elsewhere, Ethelred began believing his reign was cursed, blaming it, among many similar misdeeds, on his mistreatment of the Abbey of Abingdon. During the early years of his administration, he had sold the abbot's post to the brother of one of his liegemen, Elfric of Hampshire, one of the many men he blamed for leading him astray, which motivated him to reform his ways after 993, in a period of his reign marked by a renewed commitment to God and the atonement of his past sins. In addition to following a new penitential path, Ethelred further tried to diminish the Viking threat by strengthening his bonds with the Dukes of Normandy, marrying the Norman princess Emma in 1002. Yet this was initially less effective than he had hoped, as later that year he caught wind of a Danish conspiracy to overthrow his realm, leading to his sanctioning of the infamous massacre of St. Brice's Day, an attempted extermination of every single Dane in the realm, which witnessed atrocities that his new half-Danish bride would have looked upon in horror. The consequences of this, for the rest of his life, and the beginning phase of Edward's existence, he would have to deal with. Relations between Normandy and England at this time were growing increasingly strained by the fact that Normandy was becoming a renowned safe haven from which Viking pillagers were allowed to conduct their operations against Britain. However, thanks to the intervention of the Pope, both kingdoms began to foster an alliance with each other from 990 and 991, which was officially sealed later on in 1002, following the marriage of Emma to King Ethelred. This union has been viewed by many as the reason why their son Edward the Confessor, who was of both Norman and Anglo-Saxon stock, and who had never fathered an heir, may have later promised the English throne to William of Normandy, who was Emma's great-nephew, and thus a cousin to Edward, and who became William the Conqueror after his successful annexation of England in 1066. Nevertheless, throughout his life, Edward would have a complicated relationship with his mother, a queen so desperate to remain at the center of the political scene that she was prepared to sacrifice anything if it got her a better position, including Edward, whom she abandoned in 1017 to marry the Danish conqueror King Canute, only resuming contact with him 20 years later, when civil unrest threatened to topple her. Edward had one brother, Alfred, who died in 1036 or 1037 without marrying, and whose murder would always be an uncomfortable point of contention with the family of his future bride Edith. He also had one sister, Godgifu, who married Drogo, Count of the Vexin, and then Eustace II, Count of Boulogne, after her first husband's death in 1035. In addition, Edward had one younger half-brother, Harthacnut, who was briefly the King of England, and one younger half-sister, Gunhild, who was later Queen Kunigund of Germany. They were both the products of Emma's betrothal with Canute, as well as 6 older half-brothers born from Ethelred's first marriage to the daughter of the Earl of Northumbria, Elfgifu, namely Athelstan, Ecgbert, Eadred, Eadwig, Edgar, and finally, Edmund, the oldest, whose surviving son and grandson, Edward Etheling and Edgar Etheling, both of pure Anglo-Saxon descent, were later welcomed into Edward's household. Descriptions of Edward's appearance and personality only appear towards the end of his life when he was around 60 years old. But even so, he is still described as being a tall and imposing figure with milky white hair and beard, a broad and flushed face, long emaciated fingers that let light pass through the gaps, eyes shining with humility, and a king who was gracious and friendly to all those he met. He was famed for possessing a remarkable degree of self-restraint he maintained despite the many losses and betrayals he suffered, and who was cheerful with a strong moral compass, blessed with good judgment that improved with age, and who treated his petitioners, rich or poor, with equal respect and dignity. This contrasted with a darker temperament that occasionally flared up in sudden bursts of anger. But to all who knew him, this quickly subsided, for Edward much preferred being kind to being cruel, when he was not engrossed in the day-to-day business. Of the realm, Edward, like many kings of his day, enjoyed the thrill of the hunt, an activity which in the later years of his reign he seemed to prioritize by increasingly offloading the responsibilities of maintaining law and order to his regional kinsmen in order to find more time to pursue his favorite hobby, which even at age 60 he was still practicing and studying with the aid of the many illuminated books on falconry he is said to have also possessed. Edward was also an avid collector of holy relics, and although not a big reader, he was well respected throughout the realm as being an enthusiastic patron of the arts. According to one commentator, his loving generosity attracted to the realm men learned in many arts, including many foreign monks, whose discipline and devotion he is said to have admired. Although details about Edward's early life are hazy, some sources claim that as a young child he was taken by his parents to the monastery of Ely and placed on the altar there, wrapped in a pall adorned with light green circles, in a gesture that illustrated their desire to put the young princeling on the path to being a monk, and that until 1014, Edward, alongside his brother Alfred, was mentored by Bishop Elphin of London. Although it is hard to know if this particular detail about his early upbringing is true or false, what is sure is that during Edward's childhood, as the newest addition to the Anglo-Saxon ruling house, he would experience, either with his own eyes or from second-hand accounts, the destabilizing effects of the vicious Viking campaign to destroy England, led principally by the enigmatic Danish lord Svein Forkbeard. When Edward was born, the Kingdom of England was being consistently harried by Scandinavian warlords, a desperate situation that was compounded by a great famine in 1005, so terrible, according to Archbishop Wulfstan of York, that no one ever remembered one so grim before, viewed as a disaster of such apocalyptic scale that many in the church attributed it to the final reckoning of God, and the materialization of the prophecy that 1,000 years after the death of Jesus, Satan would break free of his bondage to wreak havoc upon the land. This opinion was also shared by the pious Ethelred, who in a bout of violent religious extremism removed 3 of his lords from their offices in 1006, gouging out the eyes of Wulfhere and Ufagiet, and confiscating the territories of another leading thegn called Wulfgeat. As Edward turned into a toddler, England was ravaged by a series of devastating Viking sorties in 1006 and 1007, which saw them pillage and loot every shire in Wessex, a wave of terror that only ended after Ethelred gave the aggressors an enormous tribute, buying him time to build up a sizable navy in 1008 to defend against future incursions. By 1009, this navy, assembled at Sandwich, was the largest English naval force ever recorded. This period of uneasiness and anxiety was punctured by further personal tragedy for Ethelred, who lost 2 of his sons from his previous marriage to Elfgefu, Ecbert in 1006, and the youngest of Edward's half-brothers, Edgar, in 1008. This tale of woe continued into August 1009, when a Viking force led by the Danish Jarl Thorkel, comprising Danes, Swedes and Norwegians, tore through Canterbury, East Kent, Berkshire, and up the coasts of Sussex and Hampshire. In 1010, with England being further pummeled by Viking assaults, this time targeting East Anglia, Ethelred despairingly turned to God once more by organizing a barrage of spiritual countermeasures, including changing the images on his coins to the Lamb of God, ordering that on the Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday before the feast of St. Michael, all his subjects should fast on bread and water in order to combat the devil, and insisting that every religious institution in the land should sing a hymn called Against the Heathen every day, in a flurry of desperate appeals that may have been some of Edward's first memories. Yet Ethelred's pleas to the divine remained unanswered, as the following year in 1011, the Danish menace Thorkel, on behalf of the Danish king Svein Forkbeard, returned to wage an offensive that ripped through the shires of the south, the east, and the Midlands, followed by the premature death of yet another of Edward's half-brothers, Edred, in 1012, and also the murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Elfhere, butchered in a drunken rage by Thorkel's soldiers after he refused to be ransomed. This year also marked the introduction of the Heregeld, an exploitative tax that effectively made England a vassal state of the Danes. For now, Ethelred was forced to pay a yearly tribute to upkeep the armies of the Danes, who in return offered their protection. Although the Heregeld marked the ultimate capitulation of the English to the Viking scourge, it gave Ethelred and his royal court some much-needed breathing space, and Edward, a child of around 9 years old at this time, would have felt a sudden uprush in optimism as Ethelred and his 3 remaining older half-brothers, Athelstan, Edmund, and Edwig, plotted their next move. However, in July 1013, all hopes of extinguishing the Danish presence once and for all crumbled after an enormous Danish invasion fleet arriving at Sandwich proved so formidable that all of Ethelred's allies quickly surrendered. Although London remained the only borough to put up any sort of resistance, this quickly disintegrated after Ethelred and the rest of the royal family, completely outmaneuvered, fled the country to seek asylum in Normandy with Duke Richard II, Emma's brother. Edward, accompanied by his mother Emma, his sister Godgifu, and his brother Alfred, were hurriedly flung into a boat to cross the English Channel, while their father met with them in Normandy after wintering with his fleet off the coast of the Isle of Wight. It is thought that Athelstan, Edmund, and Edwig, who all had a claim to the English throne, escaped elsewhere to avoid sharing an uncomfortable period of exile with their younger half-siblings and now rivals, Edward and Alfred. Edward's first stint away from his motherland, however, was short-lived, and in 1014 he returned to England with several envoys as part of a diplomatic mission to re-establish his father's position after the abrupt death of Svein Forkbeard in February led to a number of competing claims, including from Cnut, Forkbeard's son. Moreover, in a further twist of fate, another of Edward's half-brothers, Athelstan, had died in 1014, meaning that Edward's claim to the throne was suddenly strengthened, with Duke Richard of Normandy seeing an opportunity to install one of his nephews on the English throne. It seems that Ethelred, who was at the mercy of the Normans, started to consider his younger son as heir instead of Edmund, Edward's oldest half-brother. Nevertheless, in the ensuing negotiations, Ethelred was reinstated as king, and looking to exact revenge for the 1013 invasion, he ordered an army to attack Cnut at his base at Lindsey, in an offensive so brutal that contemporary chroniclers reported that all the inhabitants that could be got at were raided and burned and killed, suggesting that women and children were also victims of Ethelred's avenging fury, which also extended to many of the Thanes who had deserted him, including Morcar and Sigurfirth, who were lured to their deaths at a council in Oxford in 1015. With Ethelred viciously reasserting his dominance and having strongly hinted that he would pass the throne to Edward, his oldest son Edmund sought to stake his own claim in the power struggle, rebelling against his father by riding to Malmesbury, where he freed the widow of the murdered Sigurfirth and married her to win the support of a large section of the English baronage, some of whom opposed Ethelred's return. But by September 1015, Ethelred was gravely ill, and the restoration of his power was looking more and more unlikely as he gradually succumbed to sickness. With Edward, a boy of 11 years old, and hardly able to mount a challenge of his own, he instead stayed by Ethelred's side until his death on the 23rd of April 1016, and Edmund was left as the only serious contender to Cnut, whose military prowess would prove much greater in the conflict ahead. Several months after Ethelred's passing, and after a series of indecisive skirmishes, Cnut struck a mortal blow to Edmund's cause at the Battle of Asandun on the 18th of October, slaughtering most of Edmund's generals in an orgy of death that, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, took the lives of all of the chief men in the English race, including the irrepressible Elfric of Hampshire, a man who had served the Anglo-Saxon monarchy for over 3 decades. Cnut's triumph would be topped by the sudden death and possible murder of Edmund on the 30th of November, 1016, and as Knut victoriously crowned himself King of England in 1017, Edward, having received his baptism by fire, scampered back to Normandy to avoid being executed and began an extended period of exile. He would not, however, be joined by his mother Emma, a woman who relished the trappings of power and who saw in the accession of the new Danish monarch a chance for her to reclaim her position at the English court. In July 1017, and to the resentment of Edward, Emma returned to England to marry King Cnut, who divorced Elfgifu of Northampton, with whom he fathered children including Harold Harefoot, in order to enter a matrimony with an ex-Queen of England that would legitimize his authority, and which produced a further 2 of Edward's half-siblings, Harthacnut, his half-brother, and Gunhild, his half-sister. As Emma became the new Queen of Denmark, Edward, probably feeling neglected and forgotten, forged a new life for himself on the continent. Although opinion at the Normandy court was divided over his presence, Edward was dutifully protected by them throughout his time there. With the Danes consolidating their new English holdings, Edward all but disappeared from the political scene for 20 years. It was not until 1035 that he became relevant once again after the death of King Cnut on the 12th of November, led to the full-scale disintegration of his power in England, Denmark, Norway and Sweden, and the rise in popularity of Emma's stepson, Harold Harefoot, as a rival successor to Harthacnut. With Harthacnut away in Scandinavia battling for supremacy against Magnus of Norway, Emma was unable to defend his position against the advances of Harold Harefoot and his sponsors, who started a violent campaign of usurpation, leaving Emma with no choice but to call upon her ancestral home in Normandy and her sons Edward and Alfred to help her crush the rebellion. Despite having been ignored by their mother for an incredibly long time, Ethelred's sons answered her call, and in 1036 they crossed the English Channel, with Edward going on to sail up the Solent River to reunite with his mother at Winchester, where he defeated enemy forces at a battle near Southampton. Yet Alfred would not be so triumphant, being captured at Guildford by Earl Godwin of Wessex and conveyed to the custody of Harold Harefoot, who blinded him so horrifically that he soon died of his injuries. Despite Edward's victory, he was eventually forced to sail back to Normandy after being ejected by Harefoot, who in 1038 further bolstered his power by banishing Emma, who went to Bruges to wait for Harthacnut and his army to return from Norway and take back England. When Harthacnut arrived in Flanders, he had a mere 10 ships full of warriors at his disposal, but after increasing his flotilla to 60 ships, he was met by the fortunate news that Harold Harefoot had unexpectedly died on the 17th of March 1040, allowing Harthacnut to return to England unopposed, where he was crowned king. Edward, in recognition of his loyalty, was seemingly made joint ruler, but on the 8th of June 1042, after a short and childless reign, Harthacnut died. Despite rival claims from Harthacnut's cousin, Svein Estrithson, and interest from Magnus of Norway, it was Edward who was crowned king at Winchester on the 3rd of April 1043 by the Archbishops of York and Canterbury at the age of 38, an accession that was greatly facilitated by the support of Godwin of Wessex, an accomplice in the gory murder of Edward's brother, Alfred, a slight that Edward would never forget. With a desire to have a church of his own, one of Edward's first acts as king was to order the reconstruction of St. Peter's Abbey at Westminster, a building project that would be perhaps the one constant throughout a reign that was often as turbulent as it was peaceful, and the place in which he would eventually be laid to rest. Aside from this, Edward's earliest and most important political task was to win allies. For although England was now ruled by an English monarch who could trace his lineage all the way back to the first Anglo-Saxon king of Wessex, Cerdic, the brief possession of England by the Danes had left behind a strong Scandinavian aristocracy that was still highly influential and represented most powerfully by Godwin of Wessex and Siward of Northumbria, who had both risen to prominence under Cnut, the man also responsible for the appointments of most of the major figures of the English church at the time. Despite this, Edward was evidently more than happy to have the support of these lords, which was illustrated most saliently on the 16th of November 1043, when he rode with them from Gloucester to Winchester to punish the woman who had deserted him as a child, Emma, who was disinherited of her estates, and whose henchmen, such as Stigand, whom she had made Bishop of East Anglia, were removed from their offices. Although Edward's retributive feelings did not last for too long, for she was shortly welcomed back into the royal fold. Entrenching his rule, Edward lavished gifts and honours on the aristocracy, saving the most important for Earl Godwin, who Edward made his son-in-law after marrying his daughter Edith on the 23rd of January 1045, a woman who was renowned for her beauty just as much as her intelligence and virtue. Edith purportedly spoke many languages, read widely, and was a practitioner of many arts while being a devoted Christian of the highest morals. To Edith's biographer, she was not so much a spouse but a good mother, who, as well as being an astute and trustworthy advisor to Edward, worked diligently to fashion his royal image from the first moment, helping him to exhibit the splendor befitting of a king by outfitting him with the finest clothes emblazoned with gold and silver jewels, equipping him with a walking stick made out of gold and the most precious gems, as well as a saddle for his horse embellished with beautifully carved birds and creatures, and furnishing his throne room with exquisite Spanish carpets. At least in the early stages of their marriage, the couple seemed very happy together, a fact illustrated by their joint visit to Abingdon Abbey when Edith spotted a group of children having lunch at an unusually early hour. In an effort to provide them with a better quality meal, for she was shocked that they only had bread to eat, Edith asked her husband if he could make a donation, to which he laughed and asked that he would do so if someone could provide him with some property he could gather the funds from. Edith replied, saying that she had recently been gifted a village and that if Edward were to allow it, she would more than happily give it away, to which the king heartily agreed, remarking how it was a great idea. In fact, many commentators noted how, despite their troubles, the couple remained extremely close. According to one, they were like one person dwelling in double form. Another stated that Edith was divinely joined to the king's side. And, finally, that for Edith, no page of any book could please her more than one which tells of Edward's qualities. On the other hand, there were some who disliked the new queen, accusing her of stealing holy relics for her collection, and even ordering assassinations that benefited her family, who had all been elevated to the highest offices of the realm, thanks to her husband. This included her eldest brother, Swine, who was inserted as Earl of the West Midlands in 1043, her other brother, Harold, who was given control over much of Middlesex, Essex, East Anglia, and Cambridge, her Danish cousin, Bjorn Estrithson, who was installed as the regional authority in the lands between Swine and Harold in 1045, and various other members of her clan who exercised control of all the kingdoms south of the River Humber apart from Mercia, which was ruled by Leofric, one of the last remaining nobles installed by Ethelred, Northampton, which was administered by Siward of Northumbria, and Hereford, which was overseen by Ralph of Mant, the son of Edward's sister Godgifu. The last three of these constituted the majority of Edward's personal power base, greatly weaker than that of the Godwins. In addition, the Norman presence in the kingdom was practically wiped out by the rise of the Godwins, marked only by the modest holdings of the two Breton lords, Ralph the Staller and Robert Fitzwimark, as well as Edith's personal maid, Matilda. Yet although Edward's private entourage remained extremely modest in comparison to his wife, he still held a strong sway with the church, his God-given authority there acting as a much-needed counterbalance and empowering him to make his own decisions without too much Godwin influence, such as in 1051 when he rejected the ascension of Ethelric, one of Godwin's men, to the Archbishopric of Canterbury. Furthermore, in another indication of his influence over the church, Edward was able to appoint many of his own royal clerks, such as his German ally Robert of Jumièges, who oversaw the Holy See of London in 1044 and Canterbury in 1051, to the most important posts on offer instead of church candidates. This is further illustrated by the fact that between 1051 and 1057, there were only 4 monks ordained as bishops. Despite Edward's preference for his own men, he still enjoyed widespread popularity among the church, who were always suspicious of the pagan heritage of the Scandinavian faction, whose influence they much preferred to offset with Edward's appointments. even if it cost them a little independence. As well as the church, Edward also largely dictated his administration's attitude towards security and foreign relations. His experience as an exiled prince visiting many European courts during his 20-year stint away from England, no doubt coming in particularly handy. This is demonstrated by the impressive list of sovereigns who congratulated him on his accession to the throne, including his brother-in-law, German Emperor Heinrich III, who was married to Edward's sister, Godgifu, Henri III of France, who was named as a close kinsman, and an unnamed king of the Danes, who was probably Svein Estrithson, who at the time was petitioning for Edward's support to help him ward off the advances of Magnus of Norway. Magnus had designs on the English throne and was viewed as such a danger that Edward prepared his ships to defend against a possible invasion by the Scandinavians throughout 1044 and 1045, a threat that only subsided with Magnus's death on the 25th of October 1047. To the relief of Svein Estrithson as well as Edward, both of whose kingdoms were saved from a Viking assault because of this remarkable stroke of good fortune, with Magnus being himself replaced by Harald Hardrada. Perhaps traumatized by his experience in 1013 when he was forced to flee his homeland, Edward had no love for Viking warlords like Magnus, and as king sought to disempower them domestically by banishing Knut's niece, Gunhild, and her family in 1044, and prominent Danish landholder Osgod Klapper in 1046. While in 1048, he successfully fended off a Viking armada of 25 ships led by the pirates Lothan and Erling, who sailed from Flanders to ravage the southeastern ports of Sandwich and Thanet. In fact, much of Edward's early foreign policy centered around containing Flanders and its ruler, Count Baldwin V, whose territories were a safe haven for the bands of roving pirates that consistently harried English shores, and who was prevented from causing more harm to England by a network of continental alliances Edward maintained with his brother-in-law Eustace II, Count of Boulogne, and Walter III, Count of the Vexin. Count Baldwin also damaged Edward's relationship with King Henri V of France, who, although on good terms with the English sovereign, was also Baldwin's brother-in-law and the protector of the Duke of Normandy, William. William intimately knew Edward from his time in exile, and his family, after Queen Emma was stripped of her possessions, maintained increasingly frosty relations with their previous charge thereafter. Edward's friendship with Henri III would take another blow in 1049 when, working in conjunction with King Svein of Denmark, he sent a flotilla of ships to help the German Emperor Heinrich quell the Lotharingian rebellion, which Count Baldwin entered in 1047. This intervention would have displeased Henri, who would go on to show his disapproval in 1051 by marrying one of Count Baldwin's daughters. Responding to Edward's aid of the German Emperor, Count Baldwin sent a raiding party comprising 29 vessels headed by the exiled Danish lord Osgod Klapper to devastate parts of Essex. This situation was made even more complicated by the fact that his sally was followed up by another one led by Svein, Earl Godwin's oldest son, who had taken shelter in Flanders after abducting the Abbess of Leominster in 1047 and murdering his own cousin, Earl Bjorn, before being welcomed with open arms by Count Baldwin. The chaos of the mid to late 1040s came to an end by 1050, a relatively calmer year in which Edward decommissioned 9 of the 14 ships he had hired from abroad to defend his realm from a possible invasion, extending the contracts of the remaining forces by just 1 year, at the same time that he pardoned Svein at the instigation of his wife. Basking in a temporary period of calm, Edward, who for whatever reason never fathered any heirs, was finally able to think about his legacy. In 1051, Norman sources, written after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, assert that Robert of Jumièges was sent to the court of William of Normandy, Edward's formative home, to discuss the issue of succession. It was here that Edward first promised William the English throne, a claim, whether fact, historical fiction, or a mixture of both, that the Norman chroniclers cannot be entirely trusted, which the Duke would use as justification for his later actions. Nevertheless, as Edward mulled over who would follow him, he felt increasingly resentful of the Godwins' grip on power. From 1051, the realm was plunged into crisis, as Edward sought to reassert his authority over his wife's family. It began in the spring of 1051, when Edward appointed his German favourite, Robert of Jumièges, as the Archbishop of Canterbury. He immediately accused Earl Godwin of illegally possessing several church estates, a tension that came to a head in September 1051, when Godwin refused Edward's order to discipline the burgesses of Wessex after several citizens were blamed for starting a confrontation with the men of Eustace of Boulogne, Edward's brother-in-law, who was visiting the English king on family business. Edward was so incensed that Godwin had disobeyed his command that, with the encouragement of Eustace and the Archbishop, he convened a council at Gloucester on the 7th of September, attended by his army and the forces of Earl Siward of Northumbria, Leofric of Mercia, and Earl Ralph Mantes of Hereford. Meanwhile, the Godwins called an assembly of their own vassals at Beverstone, just south of Gloucester, in which they immediately demanded that Eustace and Ralph Mantes lay down their arms. Robert of Jumièges added more fuel to the fire by levelling an accusation that Godwin was planning to murder Edward, just as he had done to his brother Alfred during Harold Harefoot's failed coup. Although each side seemed ready for battle, neither wanted to start a civil war. As Edward refused to back down, Godwin's position steadily fractured to the point where, with the support of the aristocracy, he was charged with treason and, alongside his oldest son Swine, was forced to hand over one of his sons as a hostage to Edward. As both armies made their way to London and it was announced that Swine was now to be treated as a fugitive, Godwin's forces disintegrated by the time he reached his manor in Suffolk. His hope evaporated after he received a message from the king through Stigand, Bishop of Winchester, which stated that justice would only be served when Godwin could return to him his deceased brother Alfred. Earl Godwin took the hint, and alongside his sons Githa, Swine and Tostig, fled into the welcoming arms of Count Baldwin in Flanders, while his other sons Harold and Leofwine made haste to Bristol and boarded a ship to Ireland. The men of House Godwin were denounced as traitors and enemies of the realm by Edward, who, unsure of his wife's loyalties, imprisoned Edith in a nunnery, with Archbishop Robert of Jumièges recommending that Edward should divorce his wife. The Godwins' sizable estates were redistributed among Edward's supporters, including Earl Ralph of Mante and another called Oda, who were ordered to assume command of a fleet of ships docked at Sandwich, while Edward's coastal squadrons were put on high alert as he waited for the Godwins to unleash vengeance. Edward's scions in Somerset proved their loyalty and alertness when they repelled an attempt by Godwin's sons Harold and Leofwine, en route to their father who was waiting for them in the English Channel to restock their ships at Porlock. Thanks to Edward's royal armada, he was able to repulse Godwin's first attempt to retake his English possessions in June, harassing his ships up the coast until they were forced to retreat back to Flanders. In August, however, the Godwins were a lot more successful, with the Irish and Flanders arms of their naval forces successfully linking up at Portland Bill in Dorset before moving east, where they managed to enlist many men for their cause at North Foreland and then the Thames estuary, at the same time that Edward established his headquarters in London. His land army, commanded by 5 of his earls, and his navy, consisting of 50 ships, were organised by mid-August. When Godwin reached London on the 14th of September, he established a camp on the south bank of the River Thames to the terror of many of Edward's allies, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert of Jumièges, who, realising that Godwin was prepared to risk everything and engage in battle, deserted the royal forces and fled for their lives. Some, such as Leofric of Mercia and Siward of Northumbria, stayed where they were but refused to help Edward, who was absolutely infuriated, but now realising he was powerless, agreed to meet Earl Godwin at a council outside of London on the 15th of September, 1052. It was here that Godwin proclaimed he was innocent of all the crimes levelled against him, forcing Edward to clear the Earl's name and to reinstate Edith back to the royal court, while all those who deserted the king's side were denounced as criminals. Although Edward had been thoroughly beaten, he managed to recover his position fairly quickly due to the convenient deaths of many of the Godwin entourage, such as Swine, his fiery brother-in-law, who died on the 6th of March 1052 in Constantinople, while returning from a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and Earl Godwin himself on the 15th of April 1053, who was replaced as Earl of Wessex by his son Harold. Despite the death of their patriarch, the Godwins, thanks to the behind-the-scenes influence of Queen Edith, continued to dominate the positions of the realm, with Edith's younger brother Tostig inserted as the Earl of Northumbria after the death of Siward in 1055, disturbing the pre-existing power balance of Edward's regional lords to such a degree that the son of Leofric of Mercia, Elfgar, who had been made Lord of East Anglia, was temporarily banished and part of his duchy given to Godwin's other son, Gurth, after his attempts to claim Northumbria, although Elfgar was eventually entrusted with the earldom of Mercia after Leofric's death in 1057. Gurth was given the entirety of East Anglia at his expense. Similarly, when Ralph of Mantes died the same year, Edward decreed that Harold was to be the Earl of Hereford, while at the same time another of Edith's brothers, Leofwine, was delegated a swathe of southeastern territories. This raft of appointments meant the Godwin family now controlled most of England apart from Mercia, but far from being unhappy about the new status quo, Edward seemed to support it, for it guaranteed the stability of the realm. In fact, it worked so well that after 1052 he retired from active military service, entrusting the security of the kingdom to his lieutenants and preferring to direct affairs from the sidelines while he enjoyed more leisurely pursuits such as hunting. This was the case in 1054 when he ordered Siward of Northumbria to mount an attack on Scotland, resulting in the defeat of King Macbeth at a battle in Perthshire and the installation of Duncan's son Malcolm Canmore as monarch, who would go on to kill Macbeth in 1057 and pay homage to Edward at Gloucester in 1059. Edward similarly dealt with his difficult Welsh subjects in the same way, in 1053 ordering the assassination of the Prince of South Wales, Rhys ap Rhydderch, after his border infringements into Hereford, resulting in the Welsh warlord's severed head being delivered to Edward's court. In 1055, after the rise of the Prince of North Wales, Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, and his seizure of territories rightfully belonging to the English crown, Edward would select Harold to redress the situation, instructing him to invade northern Wales. In 1062, leading to the near capture of the Welsh rebel at Rhuddlan Gruffydd, having escaped his grasp, Edward was next compelled to call upon his other brother-in-law Tostig to mount another raid of northern Wales, while Harold took command of a fleet of ships that set off from Bristol. This joint manoeuvre resulted in the submission of the majority of the Welsh noble houses and the murder of Gruffydd by his own soldiers on the 5th of August 1063, confirmed by the delivery of his head to Harold, who dutifully sent it to Edward. Most likely sitting comfortably at one of his palaces, Edward ordered the brothers to impose vassalage on the fractured Welsh, an impressive achievement that highlighted the effectiveness of Edward's system of subservient lords doing his bidding, a modus operandi that contributed to the harmony and stability his kingdom enjoyed from 1052 until 1065. On the other hand, in 1065, towards the end of Edward's life, the system of governance he had carefully crafted, in which he trusted his earls to carry out his will, broke down with the collapse of the relationship between Harold and his brother Tostig, the Earl of Northumbria. Tostig was a man whose brutal rule of the northern shires led to a widespread revolt against him that year in October, perpetrated by Edwine and Morcar of Mercia, the sons of Elfgar of Mercia, Leoferic's successor who had died in 1062. Their offspring demanded that Morcar be installed as Earl of Northumbria instead of Tostig. When Edward demanded that Harold help out his embattled brother, he refused in much the same way as his father, Earl Godwin, had done in 1051. Alongside many of the other nobles of the land who also disobeyed the king's command, Harold allowed Morcar to seize control of Northumbria and to oust the unpopular Tostig, to the fury of King Edward, whose authority had been undermined yet again. With Harold having the upper hand and the sympathies of the aristocracy, King Edward was later forced to authorize the exile to Flanders of his friend Tostig, a man whom Edward thought of as a brother. Their bond was described by one chronicler as amor, the strongest term of affection that could be used, in a banishment that would have likely torn Edward apart, and was perhaps partly responsible for the decline of his health that was about to follow. With Edward's trusted generals breaking the question of succession came to the fore again. Edward and Edith were childless, something Edward was keenly aware of in 1054, when he sent Bishop Eldred of Worcester on a mission to the German court of Heinrich III to establish contact with the son of his long-dead older half-brother Edmund, who had fathered a son called Edward Etheling, also known as Edward the Exile. Growing up in the relative safety of the German Empire, Edward Etheling had married a princess of German-Hungarian stock, Agatha, and produced 3 children, Margaret, Christina, and a boy they named Edgar Etheling. They enjoyed an influential position at the Magyar court, but when Edward Etheling visited King Edward in 1057 with his family, he died suddenly, leaving the question of succession more open than ever. This was especially significant since Edgar Etheling, the grandson of Edmund and a possible contender for the throne, was raised in the English royal house after the death of his father, whose passing paved the way for William of Normandy to stake his claim even further. In 1065, the succession dispute intensified after Harold crossed the Channel to meet William of Normandy, an event that has been interpreted by scholars writing after William's invasion of England in 1066 as confirmation of Edward's 1051 promise to bequeath the kingdom to the Norman Duke. In several highly politicized pro-Norman accounts, including the famous Bayeux Tapestry, produced to justify the conqueror's seizure of England, Norman scholars generally report that Harold crossed the Channel to Ponthieu, where he was received by Guy of Amiens, who then handed him over to William. Harold supposedly accompanied the Duke on a military campaign around Brittany, afterwards swearing an oath of loyalty that recognized William's claim to the English throne, an agreement that was confirmed by an exchange of hostages. On the other hand, those looking to balance out the Norman accounts, and who believe no such oath was sworn, have suggested that instead of promising the English crown as the Norman chroniclers assert, it could have been something much more trivial, such as a declaration to marry into the Norman house that William was able to subsequently hijack for his own narrative. Whatever the case, soon after Harold's journey to Normandy, Edward's health started to deteriorate on Christmas Eve 1065. Although the king made an effort to appear cheerful at the dining table the next day, behind the smiles he was suffering intensely as Edith attended to his every need in private. As Edward plunged deeper into the bowels of sickness, he summoned Stigand and his other bishops to inform them that the consecration ceremony at Westminster, Edward's most famous building project, on the 28th of December, should go ahead without him. By New Year, 1066, the old king, so ill that he could not leave his bed, reminisced about the bygone days of his youth and ominously told of a dream he had where the trunk of a green tree representing destiny was splitting apart, a harbinger of what was to befall his homeland. In the few times he was lucid, the king reportedly denounced evildoers and agents of Satan, issued his final writs and grants with the help of his royal steward, the Bishop Stigand, his loyal kinsmen Harold and Robert Fitzwimark, and his devoted wife Edith, who sat on the floor and warmed his feet to comfort his passing. As funeral arrangements began to be prepared, all who were by the king's side witnessed Edward making a last-minute decision that would change the course of history, as the dying king named Harold as his successor. On the 5th of January 1066, Edward died, and the dead king, with a circlet on his head and an amulet of the cross hung around his neck, was wrapped up in a shroud of Byzantine silk and conveyed to his funeral the next morning. It was a solemn affair in which he was transported from the palace to Westminster Abbey to the dirges, chants, and ringing bells of clerics, accompanying the crowd of esteemed nobles who witnessed the king's body being lowered into his tomb at the high altar, before they rushed off to watch Harold crown himself king immediately afterwards. A few years after Edward's passing, many people reported that they had been miraculously cured of their ills and ailments after spending time by the tomb of the deceased king, claims that kick-started the cult of St. Edward, which led to his eventual canonization by the church. As the years passed and the reign of Edward became distant history, new accounts of his supposed ability to perform miracles started to emerge, such as the tale of a young woman who, by the king's hand, was cured of scrofulous glands on the neck. These stories led to a renewed interest in Edward in 1102, when Gilbert Crispin, the abbot of Westminster, exhumed the old king's grave and, alongside Gundulf, the Bishop of Rochester, searched for evidence of his saintliness. However, it was only after the release of Edward's biography by Westminster monk Osbert de Clare, sometime before 1138, that the notion that Edward deserved sainthood garnered mainstream appeal from the English church and the royalty. The The first attempt to canonize Edward in the late 11th century was unsuccessful after Pope Innocent II denied the claim, but hopes were revived in 1160 after Edward's case was put forward again by another abbot of Westminster, Lawrence, who, with the backing of King Henry II, was able to provide Pope Alexander III with the necessary evidence, including the account of Osbert de Clare and several eyewitness reports that attested to Edward's divine healing abilities. The Pope was sufficiently convinced to confirm his sainthood in a papal bull published on the 7th of February, 1161. Edward was acknowledged by the Church as a holy confessor, which is a saint who was not martyred, and from then on was given the epithet the Confessor. Although there was much interest surrounding him at the time, his popularity slowly waned as the years passed and was only briefly revived by his most famous devotee, King Henry III, who, as well as naming his son after the Confessor, also had Edward's tomb restored on the 13th of October 1269 during his reconstruction of Westminster Abbey. Afterwards, a modest cult of St. Edward survived quietly for centuries more before it was abruptly terminated with the accession of the Hanoverian monarch George III in 1714. Although Edward the Confessor was the last monarch of the Anglo-Saxon bloodline and the House of Cerdic, which could be traced back to the early 6th century, to govern England, and though the first few years of his reign were fairly chaotic as he worked tirelessly to stamp his authority domestically as well as internationally, his reign after 1052 was, for the most part, very successful, a rare period of peace that served as an oasis of calm, a contrast to the mayhem so often associated with the medieval era. Yet it could equally be said that Edward was extremely lucky in that the unexpected deaths of others often served him very well. As a young prince born into the brutal pandemonium of medieval Europe, Edward's first glimpse of life was death, his agent of fortune, as the famine of 1005, so devastating that contemporaries were convinced they were experiencing the final judgment of Christ, spread pestilence and starvation to all. Edward, being the oldest child of his father's second marriage to Emma, and having 7 older half-brothers ahead of him in the line of succession, was never meant to be king. Yet by the time he was 11 years old, the savage and unrelenting medieval world had taken away the lives of every single one of his male half-siblings, and Edward was unexpectedly heralded as the rightful Anglo-Saxon heir, as the triumph of the Danish king Cnut against Edmund in the civil war of 1014 to 1016 forced him to flee into exile. Having escaped with his life and been abandoned by his mother Emma, who chose to start a new life as Cnut's queen, Edward led, by all accounts, a comfortable life as a noble refugee at the Norman court, a 20-year period that served as a stark contrast to the bedlam that had enveloped his early years, and a time in which the future king would have developed the judgment, skills, and appropriate conduct that would forge him into a sophisticated medieval statesman, qualities that would serve him well in the coming storm that ensued after the death of King Cnut and the breakout of a civil war between Harold Harefoot and his half-brother Harthacnut. After a brief campaign fighting against Harold Harefoot in 1036, which witnessed the horrific blinding and murder of his brother Alfred after he was seized by Edward's future father-in-law, Earl Godwin of Wessex, and handed over to the enemy, Edward was aided by death yet again after Harthacnut, emerging victorious in the struggle, passed away after barely 3 months on the throne. As joint king, Edward was chosen in his stead, with the support of Earl Godwin, who had changed allegiances, to govern the Kingdom of England. Edward's first few years in office were marked by a campaign to win over the Danish remnants that still occupied an influential place in society, significantly facilitated by his marriage to Edith, as recognition of Earl Godwin's essential role in making him king. Despite Godwin's kinsmen dominating many of the most important postings in the realm, Edward was able to operate fairly independently and still had the final say in most matters. On the other hand, Edward's reliance on the Godwin clan would have destabilizing consequences after Earl Godwin, believing he was above the law and the word of the king, disobeyed Edward's command to punish his Wessex subjects after their disrespectful treatment of Count Eustace II of Boulogne, the husband of his sister Godgifu, and his men during a visit to Edward's court in 1051. Showing his true colours and the lust of a man sick with power, Edward was forced to face off against Earl Godwin and his sons, whose combined strength forced Edward to concede and forgive his benefactor without a clash of arms. Yet Edward would strike lucky again, and his position would be somewhat restored after the deaths of the unruly Swine and Earl Godwin shortly after the showdown. From here, Edward was able to mend his relationship with the surviving Godwins, most notably Harold and Tostig, who became like brothers to him, and to whom he subsequently entrusted the security of the kingdom against the incursions of the Welsh and the Scots, ushering in a period of peace and stability, lasting well over a decade. This period abruptly ended when he was again betrayed by a close confidant, this time Harold, who refused, alongside many of Edward's noblemen, to help the unpopular Tostig recover his position as the Earl of Northumbria after an uprising against him by Edwine and Morcar of Mercia. With the heartbroken Edward left with no choice but to exile one of his closest friends, the king's health soon took a turn for the worse. By December 1065, after missing the consecration ceremony of his church in Westminster, he lay on his deathbed, where the question of succession came sharply into focus. It was an honor which, according to Norman sources, he had promised to William of Normandy in 1051 and 1065, and which, according to other accounts, he had reneged upon, giving it instead to Harold as he lay on his deathbed at Gloucester in early 1066. Yet Edward's true intentions were lost to history after the triumph of the Norman conquest in 1066 and the slaying of Harold, who declared himself king on the same day as Edward's funeral, and whose defeat at the hands of William of Normandy at the Battle of Hastings inspired a raft of pro-Norman accounts, confidently claiming that William, instead of Harold, had always been Edward's true heir. Athelstan, later known as King Athelstan of England, was most likely born sometime in the year 893 or 894. We have no record of his birth, but one of the most important accounts of his life does note that Athelstan was about 30 years of age when he ascended as King of Wessex. This occurred in the summer of 924, so extrapolating from this, Athelstan must have been born around 893, 894, or possibly 895. His name derives from the Germanic words edel, meaning noble, and stan, meaning stone. So Athelstan effectively meant noble stone. His father was Edward, a son of King Alfred of Wessex, a kingdom that dominated southern England in the 9th century and was the bulwark of the Anglo-Saxons against the Danes, who had conquered so much of Britain in the second half of the 9th century. Alfred was the first Anglo-Saxon ruler to organize a stout defense of his realms against the Norse invaders, and is known as Alfred the Great in recognition of this and his strengthening of the kingdom of Wessex. He would die in 899 when Athelstan was just a child, upon which Athelstan's father became King of Wessex. He is referred to in the historiography as Edward the Elder. The identity of Athelstan's mother is not completely certain. Edward the Elder had several consorts, and his marital status was at times questionable. Some historians have asserted that Athelstan's mother was the first of these consorts, a woman by the name of Ecgwin, of whom virtually nothing is known. The evidential basis for even this assertion is very tenuous, as she is not named as Athelstan's mother in any sources written prior to the Norman conquest of 1066. As such, the only evidence for affirming Ecgwin as Athelstan's mother comes from 2 centuries after his time of birth and may not be reliable. What is clear is that Athelstan had numerous siblings and half-siblings from his father's other relationships, with at least 2 other consorts named Alflaed and Edgifu. Athelstan was born at a time when Britain was mired in conflict and change. Back in the Iron Age of the 1st millennium BC, Britain was a patchwork of dozens of Celtic tribes known in this region as Britons that controlled small patches of territory. Much of the island had been united under Roman rule from the mid-1st century AD onwards, although the Caledonians of Scotland never succumbed to Roman control. Britain was one of the only areas of the empire that experienced a strategic withdrawal when the Romans pulled their legions out of the country in 410 AD, as they sought to stop the Western Roman Empire from collapsing altogether on the continent, as waves of Germanic and Asiatic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube rivers into Rome's territory. Thereafter, Germanic groups, of which the Angles and Saxons were the most numerous, invaded Britain, and carved out their own polities. In the course of the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, numerous such states rose to control large stretches of Britain, corresponding roughly with modern-day England, notably Mercia in the 8th century, while Wessex emerged as a major power. In southern England, in the 9th century, expanding into the English Midlands at the expense of a declining Mercia. Although Athelstan's grandfather, Alfred the Great, is often labelled as the first king of England, in reality, it would be the 10th century before a fully unified and secure English state emerged. Therefore, Athelstan was born into the royal house of Wessex, though at a time when the rulers of Wessex were self-consciously trying to present themselves as having a claim to rule all of England. This situation had been enormously complicated. In the 9th century, by the arrival of what are often, somewhat inaccurately, called the Vikings, the Norse people who began expanding out of Scandinavia towards the end of the 8th century went by many names in different regions, notably being called the Russes in Eastern Europe and the Northmen or Normans in northern France, but in England they were typically called the Danes. As elsewhere, the Danes had first been content to engage in raids against England and then take their loot and slaves back to Norway and Denmark. But from the middle of the 9th century onwards, they began settling in and taking control of large parts of northern and eastern England, establishing polities like the Kingdom of Northumbria and the Kingdom of East Anglia. The Danes are often depicted as having experienced a major defeat at Alfred's hands at the Battle of Edington in 878. Yet in reality, Athelstan's grandfathers' victory over them here a decade and a half before Athelstan was born had only served to check the expansion of the Danes and led some of their leaders to convert to Christianity. These accomplishments aside, Edington certainly did not lead to the defeat of the Danes, and much of northern and eastern England remained under the control of powerful Danish rulers for decades to come, with major implications for Athelstan's life and reign. Athelstan is accounted as one of the most important kings of Anglo-Saxon England, a period of English history that runs for 6.5 centuries. His apparent importance to English political history towards the end of the early Middle Ages is not reflected in the number of sources pertaining to his life. In contrast to the reign of someone like his grandfather, Alfred the Great, there are very few detailed medieval accounts of Athelstan's life. By far the best source on his life and reign is the Gesta Regum Anglorum, or Deeds of the Kings of the English, a lengthy study of the kings of Anglo-Saxon and early Norman England, written by the 12th century scholar and monk William of Malmesbury, a figure who is widely regarded as one of the great historians of medieval Europe. Were it not for William's work, for instance, we would know virtually nothing about Athelstan's youth, while he also provided the most detailed study of his reign. Admittedly, William was writing 2 centuries after Athelstan's life and reign. However, it is clear from his work that he was utilizing other sources from the 10th and 11th centuries that are now largely lost, and which would have provided testimonies about Athelstan's reign from people who lived through it, or within living memory of it. William of Malmesbury's work is supplemented by an eclectic array of other source material that sheds light on Athelstan's time. The Durham Liber Vitae, a confraternity book of the 9th and 10th centuries, provides details of events in northern England during his time. The Mercian Registers are a short series of annals which relate to the Mercia region of the English, Midlands and northwest of the country during Athelstan's father's reign. These invariably comment on Athelstan's subsequent time as king and the political background of England in the first half of the 10th century. The Liber Eliensis, or Book of Ely, is a 12th century chronicle of the history of the Ely region in Cambridgeshire between the 7th and 12th centuries, which contains bits and pieces of information on Athelstan, while there is also the material evidence that archaeologists have dug out of the ground over the years and the material culture of coins, relics, and buildings from Athelstan's time that lie in museums and libraries today. Nevertheless, there are still considerable gaps in our knowledge concerning Athelstan, and as we will see, the greatest battle that he fought, which has secured his reputation as one of the country's foremost medieval monarchs, is so mysterious in many ways that historians are unclear as to where it was even fought. Indeed, such is the potted nature of the information available on Athelstan's life and time as king, that the first full biographical book on him was only published in 2011, a very peculiar scenario for an English monarch, most of whom have been the subjects of dozens of books over the last century or so. Historians were simply reluctant until recent times to try to reconstruct Athelstan's life. Such was the lack of material from which to do so. It is from William of Malmesbury that we learn that Athelstan was favoured when he was little more than an infant by his grandfather Alfred, who gifted his young grandson with valuable presents, including a cloak dyed in rich scarlet, along with a belt that was inlaid with precious gemstones. Alfred also bestowed an ornate sword with a valuable scabbard on his grandson, presumably before Athelstan even possessed the strength to hold it aloft, as the child cannot have been more than 4 or 5 years old at the time, given Alfred's death in 899 when Athelstan was just 5 or 6 years old. It was also to his grandfather that Athelstan owed his education. Alfred the Great was more than just an effective military commander. He was also one of England's first scholar kings and had patronized a court inhabited by some of the finest scholars of the age. It was under some of these, many of them church, figures who continued to inhabit the royal households of Alfred's sons and daughters after his own death, that Athelstan learned Latin and other subjects in the late 890s and into the 900s. Coins and royal portraits provide highly stylized versions of Athelstan's appearance, though we learn from William of Malmesbury that he was slightly smaller than the average height of those times, and so not much above 5 feet, while he had a thin frame and fair brownish gold hair, although a scholarly education certainly had its merits and would inform Athelstan's reign and government in years to come. There was still nothing more significant in medieval times for a ruler than to be able to effectively lead his followers into combat, particularly when Britain was still as bitterly divided as it was in the early 10th century. Despite the lionizing of Alfred's victory at Edington in 878 by historians of the Victorian era, anxious to see in this engagement the first flushes of the English nation, the reality was that Athelstan's father faced all of the same challenges which Alfred had. Edward controlled much of southern England and the Midlands, but a much weakened Mercia still remained as an Anglo-Saxon rival in the northwest, with the Danes controlling the Kingdom of East Anglia, north of London in eastern England, and the Kingdom of Northumbria dominating northern England. What was worse, new bands of Danes were also establishing themselves at points along the southern coast, in the English Channel in the 900s and 910s. Edward responded to these threats effectively. During his long quarter-of-a-century reign, he managed to root out many of the Danish toeholds in the south, while Mercia was subjugated to a large extent when Athelstan's aunt, Athelfled, became Lady of the Mercians after her husband, Athelred, the Lord of the Mercians, became seriously ill in 909. He died 2 years later. Thereafter, Mercia continued as a client state of Wessex until 918 when it was united with Wessex, though the latter action did lead to the outbreak of some unrest in Mercia amongst the nobility there in the late 910s. This subjugation of Mercia allowed Edward to campaign with considerable success against the Danes of East Anglia, and in 917 and 918, he conquered and annexed their kingdom. Athelstan served his apprenticeship as a military commander during these wars, campaigning in both East Anglia and Mercia in the 910s, while there is more than a suggestion in the sources, fragmentary as they are, that after his aunt Athelflaed died in 918, Athelstan ruled Mercia on behalf of his father. By that time, he was in his mid-20s, a more than suitable age to serve his political apprenticeship. By the early 920s, Wessex was actually in a far stronger position than it had been in Alfred's time, with southern England, London, East Anglia, the Midlands, and the East Coast all under Edward's rule. Only the Kingdom of Northumbria in the north, under the Danish king Sigtryg, a ruler who had earlier been King of Dublin and who had extensive connections and allies amongst the Norse of Ireland and the Scots, held out against Wessex's hegemony over England. This was the political environment in which Athelstan would succeed as King of Wessex in 924. King Edward the Elder died on the 17th of July in the year 924, around his 50th year. Like Athelstan and so many other Anglo-Saxon rulers, his date of birth is unknown, and so we cannot be sure of his age at the time of his death. It is not at all certain that Edward had intended for Athelstan to succeed to all of his dominions. It was far more common in the early Middle Ages for kingdoms and lordships to be divided amongst the sons of a ruler when he died, and indeed the Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne that dominated Western and Central Europe in the early 9th century, had fragmented in the century that followed owing to its division. It seems possible that Edward had intended that Athelstan would succeed as ruler of Mercia, and that his half-brother, another of Edward's sons, Alfred, would succeed to the Wessex dominions. If this was the favoured arrangement, it never came to fruition, as Alfred conveniently died at Oxford 16 days after Edward under unclear circumstances. That there was, perhaps, some reluctance to accept Athelstan as ruler over the entirety of Edward's dominions is indicated by the fact that it was September 925, a full 14 months after his father's death, before Athelstan's coronation was held. The delay may have been owing to some opposition to Athelstan, which was drummed up by another of his half-brothers, Edwine, a biological full brother of Alfred, and a figure who seems to have had a base of support in Winchester, the capital of the Kingdom of Wessex. Athelstan eventually overcame the opposition, but Edwine would remain a rival in years to come. The early years of Athelstan's reign saw him conquer the last independent part of England, the Kingdom of Northumbria, through a combination of diplomacy and military activity. In 926, he met with King Sithric of Northumbria in the town of Tamworth and agreed to a treaty there with him, whereby the Norse ruler would marry a sister or half-sister of Athelstan's, whose name is unrecorded. The marriage alliance was accompanied by an agreement concerning the respective borders of Athelstan and Sithric's kingdoms. When Sithric died just a year later, Athelstan attempted to claim that the agreement at Tamworth had included a provision for him to succeed as ruler of Northumbria upon Sithric's death. He faced a challenger, though, when Guthfrith, a Norse ruler who had succeeded Sithric earlier as King of Dublin across the Irish Sea, and who was most likely a brother of Sithric's, put forward his own claims to Northumbria. Military clashes followed in northern England, in which Athelstan emerged victorious after what seems to have been a relatively minor campaign. Guthfrith would continue to pose a threat, though, from across the Irish Sea, and so would his son Olaf Guthfrithson, after he succeeded him as King of Dublin in later years. In the short term, the victory in 927 and the incorporation of Northumbria into his territories made Athelstan the first Anglo-Saxon ruler to fully unite all of what is now England under his rule. In this sense, it was him rather than his grandfather, Alfred the Great, or indeed his father, Edward the Elder, who should be considered the first true king of England, though clearly Alfred and Edward had laid the groundwork for the kingdom of Wessex to unite the country and had aspired to the kingship of all the Anglo-Saxons of England. Athelstan's rise to control northern England would not go unchallenged, and the northward expansion led immediately to the birth of the border tensions, which would characterize Anglo-Scottish relations for over 600 years thereafter. Although Athelstan held a gathering at Aymont just south of Penrith in the summer of 927, in which he succeeded in having several Welsh lords and King Constantine II of Scotland acknowledge his position as the ruler of the territories held by the Angles and Saxons since the 5th and 6th centuries. As soon as these other British lords and rulers had dispersed from Aymont and headed home, they began plotting against the new King of England. It was some years before minor border tensions flared up into full-scale war. This came in 934, when Athelstan was driven to invade Scotland and campaigned all the way north to the northeast, where a separate Norse kingdom ruled the coastal regions and the Orkney Islands. He then headed back south after devastating the countryside, burning crops and sacking villages in a brutal campaign of scorched earth. The conflict was not over, though, and there was a growing alliance now of the Scots under Constantine and several Norse powers and the Danes, such as King Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin, preparing to launch a combined attack on Northumbria and Athelstan's other territories. As these tensions were growing along the northern border, there were still issues that were unresolved at home in Wessex for Athelstan. His half-brother Edwine had his own base of supporters in Winchester and elsewhere in southern England, ones which had seemingly resisted Athelstan's succession to all of Edward the Elder's dominions back in 924, eventually relenting the following year. Edwine had remained problematic, though, and that he had significant supporters seems clear from the fact that the powerful Bishop of Winchester was frozen out of Athelstan's government in the first years of the reign. Although the dearth of sources for the reign means that we do not know what Edwine was doing in the years that followed, it is surely significant that in 933 he was forced to leave Wessex owing to what a set of French annals called a disturbance in England. He took ship to leave the country and died thereafter. Later sources claim he was shipwrecked at sea. However, it is now speculated that the cause of his death was rewritten in later years, and that rather than being killed at sea in a storm of some kind, Athelstan actually had his half-brother killed. The timing suggests that Edwin had possibly become a focus of discontent and plotting against Athelstan. Perhaps he had been in contact with Athelstan's enemies in Scotland or across the Irish Sea in Dublin, and the king decided to rid himself permanently of a rival who had been a thorn in his side for many years. It is impossible to know for sure. The threat which the growing alliance of the Scots and Norse lords of Scotland, the Orkneys, and the Irish Sea region posed to Athelstan and his newfound dominance of northern England came to a head in 937 in what must surely rank as one of the most important but mysterious battles in English political history. Historians agree that the Battle of Brunanburh was every bit as important as Alfred's victory at the Battle of Edington over half a century earlier in establishing a united England broadly under Anglo-Saxon control. For instance, the Annals of Ulster, a lengthy set of Gaelic annals focusing on Ulster in the north of Ireland over a period of 1100 years, though relating events across the Gaelic world, including Scotland, refer to Brunanburh as a great victory for Athelstan and a lamentable and horrible battle for Gaelic lords like King Constantine of Scotland. As such, it is clear Brunanburh was an era-defining clash. However, nobody knows exactly where it was even fought. Many historians assume, given the identity of the antagonists and the fact that control of Northumbria was the main point of contention, that it occurred somewhere along the modern-day Anglo-Scottish border. Others are not so sure and argue that the clash may have occurred substantially further south towards the English Midlands, around Northampton, or near the modern-day city of Birmingham. The latter argument is quite weak though, as an Old English poem recounted in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, an eclectic compendium of hundreds of years of Anglo-Saxon history, states that the battle took place near the coast or a large river of some kind. No archaeological site has ever been identified to correspond to the battle, though surely a plausible candidate is the northwestern region of England around Liverpool, north towards Blackpool. One brief account of the battle notes that one of the Norse contingents that fought in the battle was able to make a hasty retreat back across the Irish Sea to Dublin in the aftermath of it. The location of Brunanburh may be contentious, but the result isn't. Armies of an unknown size squared off against each other. Athelstan's Anglo-Saxon forces, which must have included a sizable contingent of Danes who were second and third generation settlers in places like East Anglia and willing to fight for an Anglo-Saxon king, faced a coalition of Scots and Norse. Soldiers led by King Constantine of Scotland, King Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin, and a number of more minor lords, which probably included King Owain of Strathclyde. These enemies of Athelstan had different personal motives for resisting his expansionist policies, with Constantine and the other Scots anxious to prevent any further northern expansion and, if possible, to reclaim parts of Northumbria, while Olaf believed he had a claim to Northumbria by right of his relation to the deceased King Sihtric. Whatever ambitions they might have had soon vanished. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Athelstan won the greatest victory that the Anglo-Saxons had ever achieved on British soil in over 4 centuries since their first arrival. The Norse of Dublin fled back across the Irish Sea, and their allies dispersed northwards, leaving Athelstan in uncontested control of Northumbria for the remainder of his reign. It was not just in Northumbria that Athelstan expanded his dominions, or at least aspired to. His reign also marked a significant step towards a king of England putting forward a claim to Wales. The people of Britain today are used to the island being divided politically into the distinct countries of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, albeit ones which are politically united as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But this was not always the case. The Celtic Britons of pre-Roman Britain would have made no such distinction between England, Wales, and Scotland. Instead, the idea of a distinct Scotland emerged as this was the portion of the island the Romans never conquered, while it was also heavily Gaelicized by Gaelic Irish settlers from the north of Ireland in late antiquity and the early medieval period, in contrast to the lands further to the south. Wales's independent political identity came about largely because this part of southern Britain was not conquered by the Angles and the Saxons in the 5th and 6th centuries, while some of the Anglo-Saxon lords of the early medieval era, notably King Offa of Mercia, began building earthwork defences across the region where the border between England and Wales lies today. The most famous element of this is Offa's Dyke, erected in the 8th century, large stretches of which are still visible in the landscape along the border. The Cymry people here gradually began developing a distinct identity west of Offa's Dyke, which would become known as Welsh identity over time, with its own distinct language. Despite these developments, the geographical proximity of Wales to England, with its very long border, made it somewhat inevitable that once an Anglo-Saxon ruler had united England in the manner which Athelstan did by 927, he would try to impose his rule over Wales. Signs of Athelstan's ambitions were seen at the council he convened at Aymont in 927 to have the other lords and monarchs of Britain acknowledge his control over Northumbria. Several Welsh lords, such as Hywel of the West Welsh, were present at this gathering, and to Athelstan's mind, it could have been viewed as more junior lords, coming to acknowledge his suzerainty over them. A further separate meeting between Athelstan and the Welsh lords was held at Hereford in the English West Midlands near the Welsh border later in 927. Here, Athelstan's claims to influence in Wales were made more expressly clear when Hywel, Owain of Gwent, and a number of other major Welsh lords agreed to pay an annual tribute to Athelstan, while lords such as Idwal, King of Gwynedd, who had not been present at Aymont, also submitted at Hereford. Exactly why they did this is unclear, and the lack of source material prevents us from fully determining what happened. The fact that Athelstan subsequently took hostages in the form of younger sons and relatives of these Welsh lords to be raised at his court in England as a guarantee of their future obedience clearly indicates they entered into these vassalage agreements unwillingly. Perhaps Athelstan had campaigned against the Welsh in the mid-920s, forcing them to acknowledge him as their overlord, and details of these military ventures are simply not recorded in the handful of medieval chronicles which briefly cover Athelstan's reign. Whatever the circumstances of how it came about, Athelstan's partial subjugation of the Welsh lords in the 920s and the manner in which he had campaigned militarily into Scotland in 934 led to a growing belief in him as not only the king of a united England, but also in his ability to exercise imperium or imperial rule over all of Britain. In line with this, he consciously tried to present his claim to be the ruler of a united Britain to the world as his reign progressed. In the mid-920s, shortly after he had become King of Wessex, Athelstan is still described in charters and other royal documents that have survived as the King of the Anglo-Saxons, the same title his grandfather Alfred and father Edward had generally used on royal documents. Yet from 927 onwards, the titles which he used on charters and other documents demonstrated his growing claims to not just rule England, but all of Britain. Some used the Latin term Rex Anglorum, meaning King of the English. Others went beyond this to use the phrase Rex Totius Britannia, King of all Britain, though other documents equivocated more, and Athelstan had himself defined in these as King of England and Guardian of Britain, an ambiguous title which acknowledged that he only controlled England but aspired to exercise a form of imperial rule over the entirety of Britain. This is an enormously important development. The kings of England for centuries to come, particularly so in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, would aspire to universal rule of Britain. There is a direct line between Athelstan's actions in this regard and the reign of King Edward the Confessor in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the English monarch who finally conquered Wales and nearly Scotland as well. There were other, distinct new elements to the way Athelstan ruled. He expanded the convening of witans or councils. These had been used by various Anglo-Saxon monarchs since the 7th century, but they were being more systematically used as a way of governing by Athelstan's time. The size of the witans convened by Athelstan and the frequency with which they met have led some historians to suggest that Athelstan was an important figure in the development of what might be considered to be an embryonic parliament in England. This probably goes too far. The likelihood is that Athelstan and his father Edward before him had simply expanded their dominions so significantly in the 910s and 920s, effectively adding Mercia, East Anglia and Northumbria to the territories, that it was necessary to convene ever larger wietans and more frequently in order to hear the grievances of local lords and officials and allay the possibility of regional revolts and disturbances. If the expanded use of wietans and royal councils by Athelstan was simply an expediency designed to ensure that the lords of his realms remained peaceful and obedient, there was nothing piecemeal or half-hearted about the manner in which he sought to centralize power at his court in Winchester. Through the use of legal and administrative instruments, one of the most important elements of this was through the increased use of royal charters. Royal charters had been used throughout Anglo-Saxon history, but, in contrast to the general lack of histories and chronicles on Athelstan, there was a pronounced increase during his reign in the number of royal charters that were issued. Furthermore, studies of these have identified clear literary connections in terms of how they were being composed, and that they must have been the work of a handful of anonymous scribes who were employed by Athelstan at Winchester over a period of years, pointing towards a growing chancery or embryonic civil service of a kind at the court there. Similarly, while coins had been issued by Athelstan's Anglo-Saxon predecessors in Wessex, Mercia, and elsewhere in England for centuries, Athelstan was a master of their use for political purposes. It was from the coins that English men and women used for trade and commerce in the 930s that they read the words Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all of Britain, next to the side profile image of Athelstan, telling the king's subjects that he now aspired to the rule of all of Britain. Few people would have been literate enough to understand the words themselves. However, their meaning would have been shared by those who could. The charters that were being issued by Athelstan's government point towards his concern for a wide range of legal issues that were facing England in a time of growing government activity. For instance, the Ordinance of Dunseat was issued to regulate legal jurisdictions along the border with Wales, while there were also a wide range of laws on local issues for regions like London and Kent, issued in Athelstan's name, a sign that government was expanding and its range of concerns growing greater was seen in the issuance of an ordinance on charities, which sought to regulate the manner in which poor relief was offered by the religious houses and other institutions. Some of this legislation, when it came to things like the laws around theft and the collection of local taxes, would influence English law for centuries to come. It is understood that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Wulfhelm, may have been the intellectual driving force behind some of these new pieces of legislation. Nevertheless, the fact that Athelstan was willing to champion them and introduce them as new laws during his reign attests to his dynamism as a ruler. As much as these developments point towards a more centralized and powerful state developing under Athelstan, the reality was that any early medieval kingdom had only limited abilities to exercise control over a large state, stretching from Northumbria in the north to the English Channel in the south, and from Cornwall in the west to the Wash on the north sea on the east coast. Athelstan consequently had to rule through a number of powerful local lords known in Anglo-Saxon England as ealdormen, from which the modern municipal title of alderman derives. Some of these ealdormen could be immensely powerful figures who effectively ruled their localities on behalf of the king. It would be premature to describe Athelstan as ruling over a feudal lordship. That would only come later through Norman culture. But it is necessary to note that Athelstan, as powerful and significant a monarch as he was not an autocratic king in the shape of a 17th or 18th century ruler of an absolutist monarchy like France or Russia. He was always reliant on close relations with figures like the ealdormen to retain control over such a large kingdom as the one he had built by the 930s. While unfortunately, we know very little about Athelstan's personal life and the nuances of his character, we do know that he had a more cosmopolitan outlook than his predecessors. Athelstan was the first Anglo-Saxon ruler to develop a foreign policy which purposefully sought to develop ties between the royal house of England and some of the leading royal lines and noble households of continental Europe. He did so by organizing a series of marriages between his extended family members and other European rulers. For instance, in 926, he received an embassy from France which proposed a marriage alliance between Hugh of Neustria and Athelstan's half-sister, Eadhild. The marriage alliance that was negotiated included the gifting of several holy relics to Athelstan, the collection of which was a personal obsession of Athelstan's. 4 years later, Eadgith, another half-sister of Athelstan's, was married to Otto, the future king of Germany. Hence, there was a deliberate policy followed by Athelstan designed to cultivate links to the royal houses of France and Germany, and leading lords therein. It was not simply marriage alliances that characterized Athelstan's foreign policy. His court also became a center of intrigue for individuals with interests in the kingdom of the Franks and elsewhere. Back in 922, 2 years before Athelstan succeeded his father, his half-sister, Edgifu, who some years earlier had married Charles the Simple, king of the Franks, arrived back home in England with her and Charles's young son, Louis. The circumstances were that Charles had been removed from the throne in France and had his throne usurped by Robert, Count of Paris. Edgifu had returned home not only looking for aid to support her husband's cause, but that of her son Louis. Athelstan allowed Edgifu and Louis to remain in England after he became king, and his court became a regular haunt of Frankish nobles who wanted to support Charles the Simple's cause. That became Louis's cause from 929 onwards when Charles died, and from that date onwards, Athelstan was effectively supporting his half-nephew, claimed to the title of King of the Franks. Louis had many supporters, chief amongst them the Margrave of Neustria, Hugh the Great, who in 936 paved the way for Louis to return to France and claim his father's throne. It was the beginning of an alliance between the Frankish state and England, as Athelstan contributed towards a fleet which King Louis sent to reduce some of his more unruly lords in the Flemish sections of the Low Countries in 939. Other visitors to Athelstan's court in the 930s from the continent included lords of northern France, who were being displaced by the Norse settlers there, in a portent of England's future issues with the Normans across the English Channel. Athelstan's foreign policy, when it came to the monarchies and states of continental Europe, centered on marriage alliances, and these entirely revolved around his half-siblings and their offspring. This was because Athelstan did not marry himself, nor is there any evidence that he entered into concerted marriage negotiations at any time, and he was clearly an intentional bachelor. Most historians of late Anglo-Saxon England agree that Athelstan's decision not to marry was owing to his clear religious piety and a desire to remain celibate. The various chronicles and annals mention that he was unusually religious, and this accounts for his not marrying. He almost certainly didn't have any children out of wedlock either, although there is one curious stray reference in the book of Ely to Ely Cathedral as having received gifts and a financial bequest of some kind from a daughter of Athelstan's. The most likely explanation for this erroneous statement is that the compiler of the book, which was produced in the 12th century, some 200 years after Athelstan's time, mistook one of his half-sisters, or a niece, for the king's daughter. Athelstan's religious fervour was symptomatic of an era of growing Christianity in England. This was part of a religious reform movement which had begun under Athelstan's grandfather, and which continued into the 10th century, part of which was owing to a strand of thought known as millenarianism, which perceived that the approach of the year 1000, the millennium anniversary of Jesus' birth, might augur the second coming of Christ. Athelstan's religiosity led him to patronize numerous monastic abbeys and institutions. For instance, he founded new abbeys, those of Milton Abbas in Dorsetshire and Muchelney in Somersetshire being the most prominent. Other existing religious houses that benefited from his largesse included Malmesbury Abbey, given that the main chronicler of his reign, William of Malmesbury, was a monk here 2 centuries later. We need to bear in mind that William might have been inclined to present an overly positive account of Athelstan in his portrayal of the king and his accomplishments as a monarch who had patronized Malmesbury Abbey. More broadly, Athelstan was at the center of the Benedictine reform movement of the 10th century, one which sought to revitalize the Benedictine order that dominated monasticism in early medieval Europe, but which was perceived as having become overly worldly and materialistic by the 10th century. Athelstan and other monarchs of the time called for a return to a strict adherence to the 6th century rule of St. Benedict, a guidebook which laid down clear strictures concerning monastic behavior and observances. One of the most curious elements of Athelstan's reign and character, and one which was intimately connected to his religious piety, was his role as a relic collector. His interest in collecting ornaments which were associated with saints and even with Christ himself was so great that it was known internationally. William of Malmesbury tells us about a letter which he claims to have seen from the prior of an abbey in Brittany in northwestern France, written to Athelstan, in which he noted his awareness that relics were, quote, dearer to you than all earthly substances. This is confirmed by other sources, which note that Athelstan hired individuals whom he sent to travel around continental Europe in search of religious relics that could be acquired and brought home to England. Some of the figures involved were leading clerics including the Bishop of Worcester, Chenwald, who visited Germany on business of this kind. Amongst the most famous of the relics believed to have been acquired were the Holy Lance or Spear of Destiny, the weapon which was said to have been used to pierce the side of Jesus crucified on the cross by a Roman soldier who wanted to confirm that he was in fact dead, as well as the sword of Constantine, a blade which was believed to have had pieces of the true cross embedded into the hilt. The authenticity of such relics is of course dubious. There were many different versions of the Holy Lance floating around Europe in medieval times, and enough pieces of the true cross to have made up a small forest. These two relics were allegedly deposited at Malmesbury Abbey, where they acted as major attractions for religious tourists and pilgrims, while other churches and abbeys received equally peculiar relics acquired by Athelstan, including the alleged arm and crosier of St. Samson, who was believed to have played a prominent role in Christianizing Brittany, Cornwall and parts of Wales in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Following in the footsteps of his grandfather Alfred, Athelstan patronized the development of a learned court, where scholarship played an important role. All of this followed in the vein of the Carolingian Renaissance, a movement fostered by Emperor Charlemagne at his court in Aachen in western Germany in the 790s and 800s, when he had sought to restore learning and the arts in a way not seen since the demise of the Roman Empire. While England was not yet producing indigenous scholars of the likes of William of Malmesbury, who in the 12th century was believed by some to be one of the most learned men in Christendom, Athelstan's court did become a haven of expatriates from Europe who came to write and work at Winchester, evidently being offered generous terms by the English king to relocate. The fragmentary details of them indicate, based on their names alone, that several were Germans, though some were also Norse, notably the Icelandic poet Egil Skallagrimsson, who must have visited England at least briefly, as a few lines of a poem he wrote in praise of Athelstan have survived. The most accomplished of all the scholars who came to Athelstan's court was undoubtedly Israel the grammarian, a figure of shadowy origins who may have hailed from Ireland, France or Germany, but who had spent many years at Rome establishing himself as one of the foremost scholars of 10th century Europe, a polymath who dabbled in poetry, philosophy, religious commentary, literature, and even wrote a treatise on an obscure medieval board game called the Game of the Gospels. He was one of the few individuals at that time in Europe who was an accomplished Greek scholar and knowledgeable of the Greek religious philosophy called Neoplatonism, a movement which had emerged in late antiquity and which in many ways influenced the early Christian church. Athelstan's patronage of a learned court and activities as a relic collector extended to acquiring a library of valuable books and manuscripts, which he then donated to leading religious houses around England. Books were an enormously valuable commodity in early medieval England, particularly vellum copies of the Bible, which were copied out ornately. The provenance of some of these indicates they were acquired from religious houses in the Low Countries and other parts of the continent by Athelstan, often after being copied out over a period of years by skilled scribes. A common theme running through several of the manuscripts associated with Athelstan is that they featured stories of St. Cuthbert or dedications to the saint. Cuthbert was an Anglo-Saxon saint associated with Lindisfarne Abbey and the Northumbria region of northern England in the 7th century. Athelstan was particularly keen to associate himself with Cuthbert and even visited his shrine in 934 while heading north to campaign against the Scots. His intention in doing so was almost certainly to create a public association between himself and a saint that was so intimately connected with Northumbria, the better to assert his right to rule over northern England. The last part of Athelstan's reign, in the relative peace that followed the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, was spent largely devoted to these religious and scholarly pursuits. He was particularly keen to ensure that England's monastic houses and abbeys were following the religious reform trends that were being actively pursued on the continent, and Athelstan's relic hunters in Germany and elsewhere, such as Bishop Chenwald, were also charged with observing the reforms that were taking place in the Benedictine monasteries which they visited and stayed at in their travels. Hence, Athelstan's religious program extended beyond the mere collection of relics of dubious authenticity or elaborately produced manuscript books to real tangible changes to the organization and management of the Church in England in a way which impacted the daily lives of his subjects. It was a sign of how successful his construction of a unified kingdom, which stretched from Northumbria to the English Channel, had been that Athelstan was able to devote his final years to something other than warfare. It would, however, prove all too brief a period of peace for England. Athelstan died while in Gloucester, in the core of his Wessex dominions, on the 27th of October, 939. He would have been in his mid-40s, hardly an old age, though advanced, enough by early medieval standards that it may have been owing to a fairly normal illness, and there is no suggestion that his premature death was the result of any foul play. His burial broke with the pattern which had been established for several centuries by rulers of Wessex and the West Saxons, in that he was not interred at Winchester. This was the old capital of Wessex and the royal centre, where most kings had been buried for several centuries, and where the remains of many are still found in bone chests today, lying on top of stone screens just above the main nave of the cathedral. Instead, Athelstan was laid to rest at Malmesbury Abbey in Wiltshire. He may have been seeking to break with the traditions of his ancestors, who had been rulers of Wessex, and to establish a new tradition for the kings of a united England. William of Malmesbury provides an unusually detailed account of his burial. No doubt enthused by Athelstan's patronage of the abbey, he himself was a monk at 2 centuries later, describing how the many relics which Athelstan had acquired during his reign were carried before his coffin as he was entombed at Malmesbury, while many funerary goods of gold and silver were laid to rest with him. Athelstan's death cast open the succession question. As he had grown older and not married or had children, this had become more and more pressing, and a general consensus had developed around a favoured candidate, despite the fact that with many half-siblings, nephews and cousins, there were numerous potential candidates. The figure who was chosen from amongst these was Athelstan's half-brother, Edmund or Edmund, born to Edward the Elder, and his younger consort, Edgifu, born around 920. Edmund was old enough by 939 to be able to assume the throne uncontested. The change of monarchs presented an opportunity for Olaf Guthruthsson of Dublin, who, despite the setback at Brunanburh 2 years earlier, retained ambitions to claim control of Northumbria and crossed to northern England to assert control over the region when news arrived of Athelstan's death. Hence, despite Athelstan's best efforts, Northumbria quickly fell out of the control of the Anglo-Saxons following his death and would only be reclaimed gradually in the 940s. The events immediately following Athelstan's death highlight the fluctuating nature of the politics of England over the century that followed. A strong ruler like Athelstan could unite England under his rule, but once strong, centralised Anglo-Saxon kingship disappeared. There were always Scottish, Welsh, and Norse, or Danish elements willing to take advantage of the situation. Such was the case in the mid-950s, when the kingdom was divided between Edmund's sons, Edwig and Edgar. Decades of internal struggles in the second half of the 10th century allowed for a resurgence of the Danes in England, and by the early 11th century, new contenders had arisen to rule England, some hailing directly from either Denmark or Norway. Indeed, such was the ongoing nature of the Danish influence over Britain, that in 1016, a young Danish warlord by the name of Canute, or Knut, was able to establish himself as King of England. He subsequently succeeded to the thrones of Denmark and Norway in 1018 and 1028, making England just one piece of a composite North Sea empire. All of this points to the fact that while Athelstan was able to unite England for a time under Anglo-Saxon rule, the threat posed by the Danes and other Norse groups never fully subsided until the Norman conquest of England from 1066 onwards brought a unifying power to the country. When it did, they were also Norse to a large extent. The Normans might have come to England from northern France, but they were ultimately the descendants of Vikings who had settled along the lower reaches of the River Seine in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, right around the time that Athelstan was growing up and preparing to succeed his father. There is no denying that King Athelstan was one of the most important early rulers of England. Along with his grandfather, Alfred the Great, and his father, Edward the Elder, He was part of the critical process between the mid-9th and the mid-10th centuries whereby the Kingdom of Wessex in the south of England united modern-day England under Anglo-Saxon rule by conquering Mercia, the Kingdom of East Anglia, and the Kingdom of Northumbria. He achieved this largely by 927, and then confirmed his control of the north of England through victory in the decisive Battle of Brunanburh in 937, a reign-defining military clash about which we have surprisingly few details. And he wasn't vital just in terms of unifying England and having a claim to being the first true King of England. He also laid down, immediately upon uniting England, the claims to universal rule over Britain, which the kings of England would exercise for centuries to come, seeking to overawe the Welsh lords in a manner which prefigured the English conquest of Wales in the High Middle Ages and claiming a British imperium over Scotland. Further afield still, he began the process whereby England entered into marriage, alliances and dynastic relationships which would create entanglements between England and countries like France in centuries to come, while domestically he laid down the roots of the creation of England into the most centralized and effectively administered kingdom in Western Europe by the 12th and 13th centuries. In short, while we are frustratingly hampered by a lack of detailed sources for Athelstan's life and reign, there is no denying from what we do know about him that Athelstan was one of the most important Anglo-Saxon monarchs in England prior to the Norman conquest. Edward, later known as King Edward the Elder, was born in the early or mid-870s. Unfortunately, like so many other rulers of the early Middle Ages, we have only fragmentary details of his life, and even the year of his birth is not entirely clear, let alone the month or day on which it occurred. Given what we know about his subsequent life and the fact that he was entering maturity by the early 890s, it is almost certain that he was born sometime between 870 and 875. Edward is known in the historiography today as Edward the Elder rather than King Edward the Firm because the numeration of English kings reset after the Norman conquest of the 11th century. Historians centuries ago consequently gave monarchs from the centuries prior to 1066 names like Edward the Elder instead. Thus, there is the somewhat confusing situation where Edward the Elder was the first king of England called Edward, and yet King Edward the Firm is the title given to the first post-Norman conquest monarch of England, who ruled between 1272 and 1307. He acquired the name the Elder to distinguish him from his great-grandson, Edward the Martyr, who ruled England briefly between 975 and 978. Edward the Elder's father was King Alfred of the West Saxons, ruler of the Kingdom of Wessex. He had ascended to the throne of Wessex in 871, as a young man himself in his early 20s. Three of Alfred's older brothers had each ruled Wessex before him, and he had not been expected to become king. Yet when he did, he flourished in the role, and for reasons which will become clear, he is remembered as Alfred the Great today. Edward's mother was Queen Ealhswith, a daughter of Ethelred Musil, a prominent lord of the Kingdom of Mercia that controlled the English Midlands and the northwest of the country. After marrying Alfred in 868, she gave birth first to a daughter named Ethelflaed, but Edward was her and Alfred's eldest son. Another boy, Ethelwerd, and two other sisters, Ethelgifu and Elfthrith, would follow. Given that he had only one brother, and that Ethelwerd was younger than him, Edward's claim to succeed his father one day was strong, though royal succession did not at this time necessarily always follow the principle of primogeniture, whereby the eldest son of the previous monarch always succeeded. Alfred himself had risen to the throne ahead of his nephews, Ethelwald and Ethelhelm, the sons of Alfred's brother, Ethelred, who had ruled Wessex before him. Alfred's claim to the throne had been deemed better as Ethelwald and Ethelhelm were infants in 871 and unable to rule, though, as we will soon see, their claim to the throne would trouble Edward in time to come. Edward was born during a period of considerable flux in the history of early medieval Britain. Back in late antiquity, between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, the Romans had ruled over much of the island, with their reign covering modern England and Wales. They pulled their legions out of the island in a strategic withdrawal in 410 AD. Thereafter, a range of Germanic people invaded the island from the continent, the primary ones being the Angles and Saxons. With this, A period of British history known as sub-Roman Britain began and continued through the 5th and 6th centuries. During this time, the central authority of the Romans was replaced by the emergence of numerous smaller kingdoms ruled over by the Anglo-Saxons and pre-Roman Britons. These included the Kingdom of Mercia, which controlled much of central and western England, the kingdoms of Deira and Bernicia in northern England, and the Kingdom of Wessex, or of the West Saxons, in the south of the country. Later, the Kingdom of Northumbria replaced the Kingdom of Deira in the north, while the Kingdom of East Anglia emerged in the east of the country. These were Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and they continued to rule over the regions of what is now England through the 7th and 8th centuries. But in the year 793, a new invader arrived when Viking or Norse raiders attacked the monastic abbey of Lindisfarne off the coast of northeastern England. Thereafter, a period of English history began in which waves of what the English came to refer to as the Danes continuously attacked England. Just a few years before Edward's father, Alfred, rose to the throne of Wessex as ruler of the West Saxons, an unprecedented invasion of England occurred when the Danes landed in East Anglia in 865. The Great Heathen Army, as it would later be termed by the chroniclers, rampaged through much of eastern and northern England over the next 10 years and established Danish rule over much of the region. One of their leaders, Halfdan Ragnarsson, established himself as the King of Northumbria and would be succeeded by other Danes, while his ally Guthrum established himself as King of East Anglia. This was a period of great danger for the Anglo-Saxons, who were now in danger of being entirely superseded by the Danes as the dominant power in England. However, while Edward was still an infant, his father turned the tide and began to offer the first effective resistance to the Danes, defeating Guthrum's forces at the Battle of Edington in 878. Thereafter, the King of Wessex engaged in a series of campaigns which pushed the Danes back northwards. This established Alfred as the preeminent Anglo-Saxon ruler in England. Thus, as Edward was growing up, there were essentially 4 major powers in England: his father's Kingdom of Wessex in the south, another Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Mercia in the Midlands and west of England, the Danes of the Kingdom of East Anglia in the east of the country, and another polity ruled by the Danes, the Kingdom of Northumbria in the north of the country. Edward would play a major role in unifying England under the rule of the Kingdom of Wessex, though he rarely gets as much credit for doing so as his father or his son, Athelstan. If Edward's accomplishments are somewhat underappreciated today, it is quite possibly because there is a comparative lack of sources extant for his reign. Some of those from which information concerning Edward's life and reign can be derived are actually primarily sources for the reigns of his father and son. One such source is the life of King Alfred, written by a Welsh monk named Asa, who lived during Alfred's reign and the first 10 years of Edward's rule. He refers to the earliest part of the reign of Edward, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a series of annalistic chronicles charting the history of England between the 9th and 12th centuries. Also has a substantial section regarding Edward's reign, though not as lengthy as those for other early English monarchs. Several of the works of the great 12th century English scholar, William of Malmesbury, refer to elements of Edward's reign. There is also a range of other less specific data available for Edward's reign, notably the evidence of royal charters, the text of Edward's father Alfred's last will, and material evidence such as coins and archaeological artifacts. While these sources are all important and allow us to develop a picture of Edward's time in power, there are no detailed biographical accounts of Edward written by people who lived in the first half of the 10th century, when he reigned, to shed light on his life. This is a major problem, and means that there is much that we do not know about Edward today. Asa's Life of King Alfred provides some of the only information concerning Edward's childhood and education. He received a Christian education during a time when royal children were not necessarily well educated. Some rulers of England, as late as the 12th century, were not literate, but Edward's father was a scholar and had his children well educated by churchmen. Edward was taught the Psalms and to read the Bible, some books in English, and poetry. Without it being clearly stated in any medieval source, we can assume that he would have spent much of his youth at the royal court at Winchester in southern England and would have been taught to ride horses and wield a sword, as well as being inculcated with the idea that Christianity and the church were absolutely central to life in Wessex. He was still a young man, probably no more than what we would call a teenager today, when he married for the first time. His first consort was a woman named Ecgwin. She is a mysterious character. Almost nothing is known about her, and some argue that she was not actually married to Edward at all, but was in fact a concubine or a mistress, though one of their sons did succeed Edward as king many decades later, suggesting that he was a legitimate child born within wedlock. That child was a son named Athelstan. He is understood to have been born in 893 or 894. Thus, Edward and Ecgwin's relationship had begun by 893. Their union produced a second child, a daughter named Edith. Thereafter, Ecgwin disappeared. She was out of the picture by 900 when Edward would marry again. It is unclear what her eventual fate was. Edward was already playing a part in the government of Wessex during the 890s, when he was still perhaps as young as 17 or 18. A fragment of a Latin chronicle from the era, written by an annalist named Athelwerd, states that Edward led a military campaign against a group of Danes at Farnham in southern England, midway between Winchester and London, in 893. However, there are other sources which suggest that Alfred was in command of the forces of Wessex at the Battle of Farnham. Perhaps both father and son were there. Or it was also possible that the various chroniclers were trying to simply present a more pro-Alfred or pro-Edward picture by giving one or the other credit for the victory. A year earlier, in 892, Edward was mentioned for the first time in a royal charter, a legal document issued by the Crown in Wessex. In this Latin document, he was named as Filius Regis, meaning king's son. More informally, he bore the Anglo-Saxon title of Aetheling, which essentially means prince. There are 3 further charters from the mid-890s where Edward is listed as a witness to the document, and then in 898 he is given the title Rex, meaning king. It was not unusual in ancient or medieval times for rulers to appoint their heirs as a co-king or co-emperor, as their reign went on to train them for the role. This was clearly what was happening as Edward headed into his 20s. The titles which were applied varied depending on the nature of the charters. Sometimes the rulers of Wessex were referred to as King of the Saxons or King of the Anglo-Saxons, depending on the purpose of the charters in question. These titles are important as they indicate the degree to which Alfred and Edward, as his son and heir, was claiming dominion over just the West Saxons of Wessex or all of the Anglo-Saxons. Of England, Edward's father died on the 26th of October 899. The cause of his death is not known. This is not uncommon for a medieval ruler, as individuals who died often did so from an illness that contemporaries could not understand or explain. He had suffered from poor health throughout much of his adult life, and was only around 50 years of age at the time, suggesting that he had some long-term illness. Unusually, a copy of Alfred's last will and testament has survived. It, along with the only other will to have survived for an Anglo-Saxon king, King Edred, a son of Edward's who ruled from 946 to 955, is held by the British Library as additional manuscript 82-931, or titled as the Liber de Hyde, the Book of Hyde, a name derived from it having been found in Hyde Abbey at Winchester. This ornate manuscript contains a text in which Alfred lays out the history of the royal succession in Wessex, before stating that, having consulted with his council of advisors, he had determined that Edward should succeed him as ruler of Wessex, though the language focuses on the transfer of land to Edward, almost as though he was a landlord rather than a monarch. Despite the unusual language, there isn't any doubt that Alfred had made it unequivocally clear that Edward was to succeed him, not anyone else, nor was his kingdom to be divided up between competing heirs, something which had led to the division of the Empire of Charlemagne on the continent in the 9th century. Just over half a year after his father died, Edward was crowned at Kingston-upon-Thames on the 8th of June 900, a place which is now on the outskirts of London, but which was well away from the city at the beginning of the 10th century. While Alfred's last will and testament and the raising up of his son as a co-ruler in the 890s had made absolutely clear that Edward was meant to succeed him, the succession was still contested. Back in 871, Alfred had been chosen to rule Wessex by consent of the nobles and other leading figures. His brother and predecessor, Ethelred I, did have 2 sons though. As we have seen, these were named Ethelwald and Ethelhelm. Both were very young at the time of their father's death. Aethelhelm was the older of the two, and was probably only around 3 or 4 years old in 871, while Aethelwald was perhaps little more than a few months old. At a time when the great heathen army of the Danes was conquering all before them in East Anglia and Northumbria, and preparing to come south to vanquish Wessex as well, the West Saxons could not allow an infant king to come to power, and so they had chosen Ethelred's brother, Alfred, to succeed him. Aethelhelm seems to have died at some stage in the 890s, but now in 899, 28 years after he and his brother had been passed over in the succession, Ethelwald pressed his claim to succeed Alfred instead of Edward. He immediately rebelled, and he and his followers, many of whom would have believed that they were restoring the rightful order of succession that had been disturbed in 871, seized control of Christchurch and Wimborne in Dorset, the latter being a symbolic site where Ethelwald's father, King Ethelred, had been buried nearly 3 decades earlier. Here was a threat to Edward's claim to power immediately after his father's passing. It remained to be seen how he would respond to this initial adversity. It is evident from his next moves that Ethelwald did not obtain a large base of support for his claim to the crown, and that Edward was the stronger contender from the outset. Instead of trying to bolster his base of support around Dorset and the southwest, he quickly abandoned Wimborne and fled northwards. When next we see him, he was in Northumbria in the north of England, where he had carved out a local power base amongst the Danes. There are even some coins that have been found from the very beginning of the 10th century which bear the name Alvadus, a Norse rendering of Ethelwald. He spent several months here building up an alliance against Edward and the West Saxons. Then, in the autumn of 901, he sailed southwards along the east coast of England, landing in East Anglia. There, he convinced some of the local Danes, and their king at the time, Eoric, to break the peace accord which had held between the Danelaw of East Anglia, a name for the region of Danish control here, and the kingdom of Wessex. With further allies from Northumbria and even the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, which hoped to benefit from removing Edward and installing Ethelwald in his place, the contender marched into Wessex and raided Braden. Edward responded by launching an attack into East Anglia, hoping to draw the Danes back to their territory. The combined forces of Ethelwald, the Mercians, and Danes did not disappoint and headed east to fend off the Wessex army. The two forces clashed at the Battle of the Home on the 13th of December 902. The location of the battle is unknown today, though Huntingdonshire, now part of Cambridgeshire, is the most likely general area. It was a complete victory for Edward. Ethelwald fell in the fighting, as did Eoric and a Mercian prince called Brithsige. The challenge to Edward had been completely crushed, and he was now firmly secure in his rule of Wessex. By the time the Battle of the Home occurred, Edward had already taken a second wife or consort. As we saw earlier, his first wife, Ecgwin, was a mysterious character, one who some historians have speculated may not even have been his wife, but was instead a royal mistress of sorts. The uncertainty surrounding her legal status was matched by the circumstances of her disappearance. She simply vanishes from the historical records around the time Edward became King of Wessex, and not long after, he married a woman named Elflaed, the daughter of a West Saxon ealdorman, a senior noble. She must have been married to Edward by 901, from which year there is a royal charter extant today in which she is referred to as Conjux Regis, a term which means king's wife. She and Edward would be married for approximately 20 years and had 8 children that we know of together. These were 2 sons, Elfwerd and Edwin, and 6 daughters, Ethelhild, Edgifu, Edhild, Edflaed, Edgith, and Edgiver. All of this can unfortunately become quite confusing. The Anglo-Saxons named their children alliteratively, so that their names would all sound quite similar, a practice which certainly doesn't make it easy to distinguish between Edward's 14 children that we know of, especially when we consider that he had 2 different daughters from different marriages called Edgifu, while others had names that were only slightly different from one another, notably in the case of his second marriage with the 2 daughters, named Ethelhild and Edhild. The suppression of Ethelwald's revolt and the challenge to his rule had reignited the clash between Wessex and the Danes of East Anglia. Much of the first decade of Edward's reign would consequently be spent trying to follow up on his victory at the Battle of Home, to conquer the southern end of the Danelaw. The Danish ruled lands which still covered much of eastern and northern England around Northumbria and East Anglia. Edward's father had begun to aspire to rule over all the Anglo-Saxons, not just the West Saxons in Wessex, and as such is often credited with being the first medieval king of England. But this was more a statement of intent to rule over all England than something which he did in actual practice. In reality, Edward would come to exercise far greater control over England north of the River Thames than his father ever did. In the mid-900s, he began reducing the Mercians to a state of vassalage, yet again, and he also moved to erect or strengthen a series of fortifications around the Midlands and other parts of Mercia. He did so by arranging a temporary peace with the Danes, the Peace of Tiddingford, in 904. In 907, he fortified Chester and also conducted campaigns northwards in a move which violated the Peace of Tiddingford and which temporarily drove the Danes north of the River Humber, a considerable success, though a transient one as well. These initial campaigns against the Danes culminated in either 910 or 911 in the Battle of Tettenhall, sometimes also referred to as the Battle of Wednesfield, in the English West Midlands. The forces which clashed here must have been considerable, and it was an extremely bloody battle. Edward's Wessex forces were joined by a large contingent of Mercian troops, while the Danes were led by Eowls and Halfdan, the joint kings of Northumbria. At the time, who were brothers, along with Ingwer, probably another brother of the Northumbrian leaders. The clash came about as the Northumbrians marched south to retaliate against Edward for his earlier campaign. They also hoped to catch Edward by surprise, having learned that the ruler of Wessex was in Kent preparing a fleet. They had raided as far south as modern-day Bristol before the horde of Wessex and Mercia caught up with them near Tettenhall. In the ensuing battle, the Danes were clearly routed. Eowils, Halfdan, and Ingwer were all killed in the fighting. It is not clear if Edward was involved personally at Tettenhall, though the mention of him being in Kent preparing a fleet in the Chronicle suggests he was not. In any event, the victory here broke the resistance of the Danes and facilitated a more complete reduction of them in the years that followed. Over the next decade after the Battle of Tettenhall, Edward took measures to solidify his control over more of the country. All too often during the early Middle Ages, military campaigns simply involved raiding into enemy territory, fighting a set-piece battle, and then departing once the lords there had made some small act of submission. No sooner was the enemy army departed than the local lords began exercising their independence once again. Edward was determined to prevent this. Thus, in the course of the 910s, he intensified his campaign to build a series of fortifications across the English Midlands to ensure that the Danes could not easily campaign southwards in the future. These were erected at Hertford and Witham, securing London and the West Midlands against incursions from Northumbria and East Anglia, while further west he erected camps and defences at Edisbury and Warwick. By late 914, he was able to harry the Northumbrians easily, and one of the Danish lords that had risen to power there after the decimation of their leadership at the Battle of Tettenhall, Thursetel, surrendered to him, a sign of the success Edward was meeting with in imposing Wessex's control over the north and east, was that Thursetel left England altogether with his Danish followers, not long after this, evidently concluding that Francia on the continent was a better place to try and carve out his own principality. England was not the soft target it had been half a century earlier when the great heathen army rampaged through much of the country. The final push to reduce Northumbria came in 917 and 918. By the spring of 917, Edward was concentrating his efforts on Towcester and Northampton, two towns that are not far to the east of the modern-day city of Birmingham and are very much towards the very centre of England. This commanded the main routeways between Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia and Northumbria, and the Danes feared his build-up of force here. They raided south to try and remove the Wessex forces from Towcester, but were repelled. The benefits of the extensive series of fortifications which Edward had built across the English Midlands over the past decade became apparent at this point. Having repelled the Danes, Edward's forces went on to capture Derby in the summer of 917. That autumn, a separate force off to the east seized Colchester, one of the last remaining strongholds of the Danes in East Anglia. By the end of the year, with their leadership fragmented and having lost many of their rulers over the past decade, large groups of Danes in both Northumbria and East Anglia began submitting to Edward. All that remained were the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw in the north: Derby, Leicester, Stamford, Nottingham, and Lincoln. One of these, Derby, as we have seen, had already capitulated in the summer of 917. Now, in the first months of 918, Edward set about seizing the others. Leicester surrendered peacefully, as did Stamford once Edward marched into the region with his forces. Nottingham was secured through a military incursion. Finally, in 918, Lincoln also seems to have capitulated. We don't know the details of what occurred here, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in an entry under 918, states of Edward that, quote, all the people who had settled in Mercia, both Danish and English, submitted to him, a statement which clearly suggests Lincoln had surrendered too. For the first time in his reign, nearly 20 years into it, Edward had secured the full homage of Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria. Edward's reign was not exclusively about military campaigns. He followed in his father's footsteps in being a committed son of the Roman Catholic Church. He allowed Plegmund, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been appointed by Alfred back in 890, to continue the work of reform and rejuvenation that he had been undertaking for many years. The Danes, who were pagans, having brought the English Church to a low ebb through their attacks on monasteries and churches over the past century. It was Plegmund who had carried out the coronation of Edward in 899 and crowned the monarch. He continued in the years that followed to reorganize the dioceses of the English Church and appointed well-qualified churchmen to the most senior bishoprics. In 908, Edward sanctioned him to travel to Rome to become the first Archbishop of Canterbury, to visit the Eternal City in a century, meeting there with Pope Sergius III and conversing on many matters relating to the English Church. When he returned to England, he brought holy relics associated with the Armenian Saint Blaise with him. This was just one element of Edward's wider ecclesiastical program. The reform of the dioceses had lasting significance, and some of England's most important dioceses, such as that of Bath and Wells, were established out of these reforms during Edward's reign. He also oversaw or financed the establishment of numerous religious houses, notably Nunnaminster or St. Mary's Abbey at Winchester, which was founded by Edward's mother around 901, but which the king doubtlessly helped finance the building of. Winchester was unquestionably the most important administrative and religious site in England at this time, and Edward left his mark on it by patronizing the construction of what is known as the New Minster, Minster being an old Anglo-Saxon term for a religious establishment like a cathedral or monastery. The Old Minster at Winchester dated back to the middle of the 7th century, when Cenwalh, King of Wessex, ordered the construction of a cathedral there in honor of St. Peter and St. Paul. It cannot be viewed today for the simple reason that the Old Minster was demolished at the end of the 11th century, not long after the Norman conquest of England. However, for a time, it was clearly the heart of Anglo-Saxon religious worship in the south of England, and a great many kings of Wessex and England were crowned, married, and laid to rest here. Early in his reign, in 901, Edward sponsored the establishment of a Benedictine abbey, which became known as the New Minster. The abbey was right next to the Old Minster, allegedly so close to it that the monks could be heard chanting inside the abbey by visitors to the cathedral. It also became the repository of a number of important objects of religious veneration, notably the bones of the Breton saint, Saint Judoc, and later the alleged heart of Saint Valentine. Once it was finished, Edward ordered the removal of his father's remains, which had been interred in the Old Minster, to the New Minster in recognition that the idea for an abbey next to the cathedral had been Alfred's idea, though one realized by his son. The New Minster and the reorganization of the English dioceses were major accomplishments in the religious sphere for which Edward was clearly broadly responsible. On the surface, one would also think that Edward was clearly responsible for the set of religious changes enshrined in a medieval document called the Laws of Edward and Guthrum. Guthrum was the Danish king of East Anglia between 878 and 890. As Edward was the only monarch around Guthrum's time that bore the name Edward, it is logically assumed that the Laws of Edward and Guthrum relate to a set of laws introduced by Guthrum first and then by Edward a decade or so later, after the Kingdom of Wessex had acquired control over East Anglia. The laws themselves concern the collection of religious dues and taxes, and matters like the observance of religious festivals. They would suggest that the work of converting the Danes of East Anglia, which Guthrum began after he converted to Christianity, was then continued by Edward in East Anglia in the 900s and 910s. The authenticity of the laws has been doubted by some historians, but what it still indicates is that there was an impression that Edward continued the work of converting East Anglia, or the Eastern Danelaw, as it was also known during his reign. This was a considerable shift, with the laws stating that Guthrum and Edward established rules around the honouring of churches as places of legal sanctuary, and that the Christian concepts around perjury and adultery needed to be honoured. What was occurring during Edward's reign was the religious and cultural amalgamation of the Danes into the Christian society of Anglo-Saxon England. While culture was intrinsically connected with religion and Christianity in the early Middle Ages, in Western Europe, there were a limited number of other cultural developments in Edward's realms between 899 and 924 that the king furthered in some tangible ways. His father had started this process, and Alfred is known as the Great in English historical tradition, as much for his prioritizing of church reform and education as for the manner in which he checked the advance of the great heathen army in the south of England. Edward continued his father's work in this regard. For instance, there is evidence that Latin, religious and scholarly texts were being copied out extensively by monks into Anglo-Saxon English in various monasteries and religious houses in southern England during the first quarter of the 10th century. Just as the Carolingian Renaissance a century earlier during the reign of Charlemagne on the continent had seen the development of an elegant Carolingian minuscule script, so too the reigns of Alfred and Edward witnessed the evolution of Anglo-Saxon minuscule as English written script. One need only compare examples of early 10th century religious texts produced in southern England with those being produced 3 centuries earlier in Britain to see that the Anglo-Saxon minuscule is much more readable and artistic. The only ornately embroidered objects from Anglo-Saxon England to have survived down to the present day were also produced during Edward's reign. These included embroidered clothing and objects like a stolen girdle, in which scenes from English public life at this time were illustrated. They are a useful point of contrast with the famous Bayeux tapestry, which was produced right after the Norman conquest and illustrates the shift from Anglo-Saxon times to Norman times in the late 11th century. Finally, there were changes to the legal system introduced during Edward's reign. Although, as with so much else concerning Anglo-Saxon England, it is difficult to assess exactly what role the monarch himself played in developing these new laws. There are a number of legal documents from early in his reign which are found amongst the Textus Refensis of the 12th century that set out various legal measures. One of these was hardly a benevolent measure. It provided for the concept of trial by ordeal when individuals were suspected of serious crimes like perjury or treason. Essentially, this paved the way for the use of physical interrogation as a legal instrument in England for centuries to come. Though, as anyone familiar with the concept of hanging, drawing, and quartering in early modern Europe will know, treason was considered a very, very serious crime that was punished in a brutal fashion. The concept of trial by ordeal would also inform the witch hunts that occurred across Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries. Despite these legal innovations, there is otherwise a lack of royal charters for Edward's reign. Historians are confused as to why there are virtually none after 910. It was possibly because Edward relied more on his royal household rather than the established nobles or ealdormen to govern his realms, a shift in traditional practice. The popular story of early medieval England is a fairly simple one with clearly assigned good guys and bad guys. The bad guys were the Danes who brought the great heathen army to England in the 9th century and threatened to completely overrun the country, while the good guys were Alfred the Great and the Anglo-Saxons of Wessex, who stopped the Danish advance and then pushed them back northwards, with Edward conquering them and establishing the Kingdom of England in due course. Part of the reason why this is simply not true is because it was depicted in this way by members of the church, like William of Malmesbury, and the compilers of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, who wanted to present the pagan Danes as the malevolent entity and rulers like Alfred and Edward as Christian heroes. This view of the period is also inaccurate in other ways. Specifically, it ignores how fragile the new, Dispensation was in the 10th century. Edward had turned Wessex into the dominant power in England, but his kingdom remained vulnerable to raids from Norse invaders. In 914, a raiding party of Norsemen from Brittany in northwestern France, led by two warlords named Uther and Hrold, landed in the River Severn estuary and began pillaging the surrounding region in southern Wales. They then established a temporary base on the island of Steepholm in the Bristol Channel and carried out random raids on the mainland into the autumn before moving on to Ireland. This was the precarious nature of life around the North Sea and North Atlantic during the age of the Norse migrations. Edward was a powerful ruler, but his realm was always exposed to sudden attacks from Ireland, northern France, and Scandinavia. It was not always a homogeneous domain that Edward the Elder ruled over either. Take the example of Mercia. The Kingdom of Mercia had been the greatest power in England back in the 8th century, so much so that this era in English history is called the Mercian supremacy. It had been fatally weakened by the incursions of the Danes in the 9th century, and in 1883, the ealdorman, Ethelred of Mercia, had made a formal submission to Edward's father, Alfred. This effectively made Mercia a vassal state of Wessex, though as Mercian support for Ethelwald between 900 and 902 had made clear, the Mercians could often act against the interest of the established ruler of Wessex when it served their own ends. Over the decade that followed, Edward re-established his control over Mercia, and Mercian contingents fought in his armies against the Danes on numerous occasions. There were simmering tensions, though. In particular, Edward's incorporation of London and Oxford into his domains was viewed poorly in Mercia, these having been traditional spheres of Mercian power back in the 8th century. It was in this context, and while he was otherwise preoccupied with reducing the 5 boroughs in the north, that the Mercians began to shift away from under Edward's rule in the late 910s. The evidence for any Mercian revolt is admittedly quite tenuous, but there is some there all the same. Back in 911, Athelred of Mercia had died, and the rule of Mercia then switched to his wife, Ethelflaed, a daughter of Alfred the Great, who was also Edward's sister. She ruled Mercia on his behalf for several years to come, but when she in turn died in 918 and the throne passed to her daughter, Elfwin, Edward's niece seems to have decided to try and exercise a greater degree of independence. This would explain why Edward seemingly had her deposed a few months later, and would also explain why the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that all the people who had settled in Mercia, both Danish and English, submitted to Edward late in 918. If the Mercians had not revolted, then why would they have needed to submit to Edward again at this time? Therefore, it seems fairly clear that Alfwin tried to free Mercia from under the rule of her uncle when she became Lady of the Mercians. This revolt failed, she was deposed, and it brought to an end the semi-independence of Mercia. Henceforth, there would be no royal line within Mercia. Edward was its ruler, and so were his successors amongst the Anglo-Saxons. To finalize this closer absorption of Mercia into his dominions, Edward had the Kingdom of Mercia divided up into shires and other administrative units in the final years of his reign, appointing lesser nobles to govern these on his behalf. The Mercians would resist these developments in the final years of his reign and in those of his sons and successors. But there is no doubt that Edward amalgamated Mercia more closely into his kingdom from 918 onwards. The late 910s saw a new development in Edward's family life, which had considerable implications for England's politics over the 10th and 11th centuries. Around 919, he took as his third wife a woman named Eadgifu. She was the daughter of Sigerholm, ealdorman of Kent in southeastern England, and the granddaughter of Ethelwulf, a lord who had exercised a form of kingship over Kent back in the middle of the 9th century. Eadgifu was consequently from a family of Kentish royal blood. Exactly what had happened to Elflaed, Edward's second wife, which allowed him to marry once again, is disputed. The great 12th century scholar, William of Malmesbury, claimed that Edward had put Elflaed aside, and that she took up religious orders, paving the way for him to marry again. But many historians doubt this version of events, and are more inclined to think that Elflaed simply died towards the end of the 910s. Edward's third marriage would result in 4 children in as many years. 2 boys, Edmund and Edred, both of whom would eventually become kings of England, were joined by two daughters, Edbert and Edgifu, after her mother. Edbert would never marry and would go on to become a leading female figure within the English church, so much so that she was canonized within a decade after her death, which was around 953. A fable has it that when she was an infant, Edward sat her down on his knee with rings and bracelets on one side and a chalice and a copy of the Gospels on the other. When she reached out towards the chalice and the Gospels, he knew that she was meant for a religious life. These years in which Edward was producing new children again via his third marriage saw him marrying some of his children from his second marriage into the noble households of continental Europe. Around 919, Eadgifu, the daughter from his second marriage, not to be confused with his third wife, or the daughter also named Eadgifu from that third marriage, married Charles the Simple, the king of the West Franks in what is now France. Thus, Edward's daughter became queen consort of one of the great Christian kingdoms of continental Europe. Through her, Edward's grandson, Louis, would become King Louis IV of France, ruler of the West Franks between 936 and 954, though Edward would not live to see it. His other two daughters from his second marriage, Eadhild and Edgith, would also marry prominent continental lords. In Eadhild's case, she married Hugh, Duke of the Franks and Count of Paris, in 926, while Eadgith married Otto, the son of Henry the Fowler, King of the East Franks in Germany, in 930. Otto would eventually go on to hold the positions of Duke of Saxony, King of East Francia, King of Italy, and Holy Roman Emperor. The marriage of these daughters of Edward into the leading continental royal houses firmly demonstrated how far the royal house of Wessex had risen. Back in Edward's childhood, his father had been battling for the survival of the West Saxons in southern England as the Danish onslaught continued mercilessly. A half-century later, his son ruled most of England and was establishing marriage alliances throughout the lands of the great empire Charlemagne had once ruled. The early 920s witnessed one of the most remarkable episodes in Edward's reign, though it is an occurrence that has generated considerable debate as to what it signified. In the oldest surviving copy of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, we hear that towards the end of his reign, Edward received the submission not just of the lords of Northumbria and northern England, but also of what were referred to as the King of the Strathclyde Britons and all the Strathclyde Britons, who then called Edward their father and lord. This event must have taken place around 920 or 921, as there is mention in the passage of a lord called Ragnalf, who we learn elsewhere in the Gaelic annals of Ulster died before the end of 921. Whatever the exact date was, the significance is clear. Edward received some sort of formal submission from the King of Strathclyde, Owain ap Dyfnwal, while historians agree that King Constantine II of Scotland also paid homage to Edward. This is extremely significant. Throughout the High Middle Ages and the late medieval period, the kings of England would repeatedly argue that they were the legitimate rulers of all of Britain, and that the monarchs of Scotland were their vassals. This would sometimes result in English control being established over Scotland, such as occurred during the reign of Edward I in the late 13th century. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entry suggests that Edward the Elder was the first ruler of England to ever receive a formal submission from the monarch and lords of Scotland around the year 921. Thus, not only had Edward built on his father's work of establishing Wessex as the preeminent power in England, but he was now aspiring towards a universal kingship over all of Britain. There is some debate amongst historians of England in the early Middle Ages as to the extent that Edward really received the submission of the kings of Scotland and Strathclyde. That there is some disagreement on this is because it was seemingly such a temporary measure. Not long afterwards, Edward's reign drew to a close. Indeed, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle suggested that the submission of the Scots was one of the last events of Edward's reign, though the dating must be slightly out, given the reference to Ragnalf as being involved. Instead, the final act of Edward's reign was a revolt by the Mercians in alliance with some of the Welsh in 924. Edward campaigned north and crushed the revolt at Chester in the middle of the summer. He took ill not long afterwards and died at Farndon, just south of Chester, on the 17th of July, 924. His remains were interred along with those of the majority of the early medieval kings of England at Winchester, though unlike many others who were interred in the Old Minster, Edward's body was laid to rest alongside his father in the new minster that he himself had ordered the construction of. In 1110, on the orders of King Henry I, the remains of Edward and his father Alfred were reinterred at Hyde Abbey, another Benedictine monastery built outside the walls of Winchester, Henry seemingly wishing to develop the abbey as a pilgrimage site, which would benefit from having Alfred's remains in particular kept there. The abbey suffered damage during the Civil War known as the Anarchy in the middle of the 12th century, and was further desecrated during the dissolution of the monasteries undertaken by King Henry VIII in the second half of the 1530s. Both Edward's and his father's remains were lost, although an archaeological survey in 1999 uncovered a pelvic bone near the abbey, which it was speculated could have been from either Edward or Alfred's remains based on the dating of it. Edward was succeeded by his son Athelstan, born in the mid-890s from his first marriage to Ecgwin. A 12th century text known as the Textus Rofensis claims that Ælfweard, one of Edward's sons from his marriage to his second consort, Ælfled, initially succeeded Edward before dying a month later, and paving the way for Athelstan's ascent. This is disputed and is not substantiated by other texts. Athelstan's reign proved just as successful as Edward's and Alfred the Great's. He continued to wage war against Mercia and the Danes of the Kingdom of Northumbria, completing the conquest of Mercia, which Edward had done so much to advance. A sign of his success against the Danes was seen in that the King of Northumbria, Sihtric, had to call upon allies amongst the Vikings of Dublin and the Gaels of Scotland in order to try and hang on to his crown. Even with this alliance of Danes, Scots, and Irish Vikings coalescing against him, Athelstan was able to firmly wrest control over Northumbria through victory at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937. With this, the work that Edward and Alfred before him had undertaken to transform the Kingdom of Wessex into the Kingdom of England was broadly completed, and we find Athelstan claiming dominion over all of England by issuing charters referring to himself as Rex Anglorum, meaning King of the English. Athelstan achieved this, but it is impossible to imagine it having occurred had it not been for the work which Edward undertook over the quarter of a century of his reign. Moreover, Athelstan was the first English ruler to issue documents in which he aspired to be Rex Totius Britanniae, a Latin term meaning King of all Britain. Again, the seeds of this were seemingly sown in the manner in which Edward accepted the surrender of some of the Scottish lords towards the end of his reign. After the reign of his son and heir, the power of the centralized English kingship that had first emerged out of Wessex during the reigns of Alfred and Edward continued to go from strength to strength. It also continued to feature Edward's sons. Athelstan did not marry and did not have any legitimate children to succeed him. Consequently, when he died in 939, he was succeeded by Edmund, a son from Edward's marriage to Edgifu. After a short reign of 7 years, he was in turn succeeded by his brother Edred, who then ruled down to 955. Thus, after his passing in 924, Edward was succeeded by 3 of his sons in a row. 2 of his grandsons via Edmund, Edwig and Edgar, would follow that down to 975. This was a period in which the gains made during the reigns of Alfred, Edward and Athelstan were consolidated. That being said, it was not an era in which the Anglo-Saxons unequivocally defeated the Danes. Indeed, in the early 11th century, the Danes would seize control of England, and Nut the Great, a Danish king, ruled over a North Sea empire that included England, Denmark, and Norway. His reign in England was nearly 2 decades long, between 1016 and 1035, and the Danes continued to play a major role in English politics down to the Norman conquest of 1066. Thus, what Alfred, Edward, and Athelstan achieved wasn't so much the defeat of the Danes and the creation of a monolithically Anglo-Saxon England after more than a century of invasions, but rather a centralized English kingship, one which could be claimed by both the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes, who were in any event becoming less distinguishable from one another as the two groups intermarried and mixed culturally. England would become one of the most centralized and strong kingdoms in Europe during the High Middle Ages, and that rather than the victory of the Anglo-Saxons was the real success of Alfred, Edward and Athelstan. King Edward the Elder is one of England's most unfairly overlooked monarchs today. He has constantly lived in the shadow of his father and his son. Alfred earned the sobriquet the Great on account of his achievements in stopping the Danes from conquering all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the second half of the 9th century, while Athelstan was the ruler of Wessex, who first made unequivocal claims to an English kingship. But in many ways, it was Edward who did the most consequential work in uniting England under a single Anglo-Saxon ruler. He emerged from a power struggle with his cousin Ethelwald immediately following the death of his father to become Alfred's successor as ruler of Wessex. Then he engaged in a series of military campaigns in the 900s and 910s, which broadly completed the conquest of Mercia, while also launching a series of campaigns against the Danes further to the north. Towards the end of his reign, Edward was in a strong enough position that he was the first ruler to aspire to an English kingship who seemingly received a submission from the Scots. Thus, while the dearth of documentary evidence and other source material makes it difficult to reconstruct the events of Edward's reign in substantial detail, it appears that he did a lot of the heavy lifting in transforming the Kingdom of Wessex into the Kingdom of England. Alfred checked the Danish advance in the south, and Athelstan completed the unification of England under one ruler, but it was the man in between, Edward the Elder, who seemingly conquered more of the country than the other two. As such, he has probably been unfairly marginalized in the story of the emergence of the English kingdom at the end of the first millennium. And so we conclude our peaceful journey through the lives of these three remarkable rulers of medieval England. Edward the Confessor, the last great Anglo-Saxon king who walked the delicate line between piety and politics. Athelstan, the first true unifier of England, who dreamed of ruling all of Britain. And Edward the Elder, the forgotten architect whose patient conquests laid the foundation for his son's greater glory. Each of these men, in their own way, helped shape the England we know today. From Edward the Confessor's Westminster Abbey, to Athelstan's vision of British unity, to Edward the Elder's methodical expansion of Wessex into England itself, their legacies echo through the centuries. As you drift into peaceful slumber tonight, let these gentle tales of medieval kings remind you that even in times of great change and uncertainty, steady leadership and noble purpose can create something lasting and beautiful. The England these men built, through all its transformations, endures still. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet wisdom of these ancient rulers. Until we meet again in the gentle pages of history, rest peacefully with the Sleepy Crown family.